Welcome to our comprehensive course on food safety, where we will prepare you for the ServSafe Manager Certification exam. I am here to ensure you master the critical concepts required by the National Restaurant Association and the latest FDA food code. This is an unofficial, independently produced course. It is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or connected to the National Restaurant Association or the ServSafe brand in any way. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and is intended to assist in exam preparation. It does not guarantee certification or success on the exam. All trademarks belong to their respective owners. In this introductory module, we are establishing the foundation for your entire certification journey. You will learn the exact structure of the exam, how to manage your study time effectively, and why your role as a manager is the most vital line of defense in modern culinary operations. This course is designed to take you from a basic understanding to the expert level required to lead a safe kitchen environment. By the time we conclude, you will possess a complete mental framework for regulatory compliance and food science, giving you the confidence to ace your exam and improve your facility's safety culture. The ServSafe Manager exam is a high-stakes assessment that demands more than just rote memorization. It focuses on your ability to apply food safety principles like temperature control, cross-contamination prevention, and sanitation to real-world scenarios within a commercial kitchen. You need to understand that the exam content is grounded in the FDA food code, which is the scientific model for retail food store and restaurant safety. Our approach here mimics this professional standard by prioritizing the why behind every regulation. When you understand the science of pathogen growth or the logic behind storage hierarchies, the specific rules become intuitive rather than arbitrary. Success on the exam requires a disciplined understanding of your responsibilities as a manager, specifically regarding active managerial control. You are not just monitoring employees. You are verifying that your safety systems are actually working in the flow of daily operations. We will examine the exam format, which features 80 multiple-choice questions, and understand that you must achieve a score of at least 75% to earn your certification. This threshold is meant to represent competent knowledge that minimizes the risk of foodborne illness in your establishment. We will discuss scheduling your exam through official channels and understanding the strict time constraints you will face on testing day. Effective leadership in food safety starts with the mindset that no detail is too small to inspect. Throughout this course, we will break down complex topics into manageable units, moving from microbiological hazards and personal hygiene to sophisticated management systems. You will learn how to identify potential contaminants before they enter your building, how to monitor critical control points during cooking, and how to effectively sanitize your facility to prevent pest or pathogen infiltration. My goal is to equip you with the technical vocabulary and the analytical skills that the exam makers expect you to demonstrate. By focusing on systemic prevention rather than just reaction, you position yourself as a leader who prioritizes public health and operational efficiency. I look forward to our progress through these modules. Welcome to our deep dive into the three primary classifications of food hazards encountered in commercial kitchens. We are here to dismantle the complexity of contaminants into clear, actionable categories that define modern food safety management. Biological contaminants represent the most frequent and severe threat to food service operations because they are often invisible, rapidly replicating, and highly pervasive. These include bacteria, which are microscopic organisms that thrive under specific conditions, as well as viruses, which typically require a living host to reproduce. Parasites, while larger than bacteria, pose significant risks when found in contaminated water or undercooked protein, requiring both heat and freezing processes for effective elimination. Fungi, including molds and yeasts, rarely cause immediate, acute illness but can produce dangerous toxins that compromise the integrity of food ingredients. Managers must understand that these biological vectors do not follow a single behavioral pattern, meaning they require diverse defensive strategies. We systematically manage these risks through rigorous temperature control, strict personal hygiene, and the prevention of cross-contamination throughout the flow of food. When you view your kitchen as an environment that must be maintained at a microscopic level, you shift your managerial focus toward meaningful, preventative outcomes rather than reactive firefighting. Chemical contaminants introduce a different set of risks. often manifesting as acute poisoning when toxic substances inadvertently migrate into the food supply. These hazardous substances often arrive in the kitchen via cleaning agents, sanitizing liquids, and pesticides that have been mishandled or improperly stored near raw ingredients. A common but frequently overlooked risk involves the use of improper equipment, such as storing acidic juices in reactive metal containers that cause lead or copper to leach directly into the food. Polishers and machine lubricants also pose a threat if they're not specifically classified as food grade or if they are applied in a way that allows for unintended contact with edible surfaces. To mitigate these hazards, you must enforce a strict policy where all chemical storage is isolated from food preparation and storage zones. Every spray bottle or bulk container must be clearly labeled with its actual contents and the manufacturer's original safety information to prevent accidental ingestion. By treating chemical security with the same scrutiny as biological safety, you protect your operation from both legal liabilities and severe customer health outcomes. Physical contaminants are perhaps the most tangible, yet often dismissed, hazards in a professional kitchen environment because they arise from everyday operational activity. These hazards consist of foreign objects that can cause immediate injury, such as glass shards from accidentally broken light bulbs or dishware, and metal shavings resulting from damaged can openers. We must also account for accidental intrusions like bandage strips from staff with open wounds, discarded packaging staples, or even naturally occurring contaminants like fish bones and fruit pits. Structural organic dirt, such as paint chips or ceiling debris, also falls into this category when facility maintenance is neglected or compromised during high-volume periods. Mitigating physical risks requires a constant state of situational awareness and a commitment to keeping equipment in peak condition to prevent the shedding of components. Managers should conduct regular facility audits to ensure that shielding is present on lights and that all utensils are inspected for signs of wear or structural integrity failures. Eliminating these physical vulnerabilities ensures that the only thing a customer encounters is the meal they ordered, thereby maintaining the fundamental integrity of your service. See you in our next session. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will dissect the scientific principles behind bacterial growth by examining the 6 environmental factors collectively known as FAT-TOM. To control the biological hazards within a kitchen, a manager must understand the conditions that facilitate rapid microbial reproduction. The acronym FAT-TOM serves as a heuristic device for these variables: food, acidity, temperature, time, oxygen, and moisture. When bacteria have access to these stable environmental factors, their populations can double every 20 minutes under optimal conditions. Our goal is to manipulate these variables to disrupt the cellular replication cycles of pathogens. By systematically limiting these conditions, we effectively move from reactive food safety to proactive systemic control. The first variable is food, specifically referring to the nutrient profile required for bacterial metabolism. Bacteria thrive on foods rich in protein and carbohydrates, such as prepared meats, poultry, dairy products, and cooked grains. These items represent TCS foods, or foods requiring time and temperature control for safety, because they provide the necessary organic compounds for cellular growth. If you provide a substrate with sufficient nutrients, the bacteria will utilize these as building blocks for energy and structural replication. Managing this primarily involves reducing the duration nutrients are available at room temperature or by utilizing chemical barriers. Acidity represents the second factor, measured on the pH scale ranging from 0.0 to 14.0. Most foodborne pathogens find an environment with a pH between 4.6 and 7.5 to be most hospitable for replication. Below a pH of 4.6, the environment is generally considered too acidic for significant bacterial growth, which is why pickling or adding vinegar acts as a preservation technique. Foods like neutral legumes or mild dairy fall squarely into this high-risk range, requiring constant monitoring. By shifting the pH of a solution, you hinder the functionality of bacterial enzymes essential for metabolic processes. Temperature remains the most significant intervention point for a food manager since it directly dictates the velocity of enzymatic reactions within a cell. Bacteria replicate most aggressively in the temperature danger zone, which spans between 41 degrees Fahrenheit and 135 degrees Fahrenheit. In this range, the internal chemistry of the organism is optimized, leading to exponential increases in colony size. Conversely, lower temperatures induce a state of dormancy, while temperatures above the threshold cause protein denaturation and cellular death. Maintaining internal product temperatures outside this spectrum is essential for safety. Time is the fourth dimension of this model, acting as a multiplier for all other factors. Bacteria require sufficient time to acclimate to a new environment and subsequently replicate, but this window is surprisingly narrow. If food spends a cumulative total of more than 4 hours within the temperature danger zone, the microbial load often reaches dangerous levels. Even if the environment is not perfectly optimized for a specific pathogen, the additive effect of time usually compensates for suboptimal conditions. Controlling the exposure duration is effectively the only way to manage risk when other variables are difficult to negate. Oxygen availability determines the metabolic strategy the bacteria will employ, dividing them into aerobic, anaerobic, or facultative categories. Aerobic bacteria require oxygen to survive, while anaerobic organisms, such as those responsible for botulism, thrive in oxygen-free environments like vacuum-sealed packages. Facultative bacteria are the most versatile, as they can adapt to either environment. When you vacuum package a TCS food item, you effectively eliminate aerobic competition and potentially favor the growth of anaerobic pathogens. Understanding the oxygen requirements of different spoilage and pathogenic agents is crucial for storage and packaging decisions. Moisture, or more accurately water activity, is a measure of the amount of water available within a food for chemical reactions. Bacteria need a water activity level of 0.85 or higher to sustain the osmotic pressure and metabolic functions necessary for binary fission. Reducing the water activity through methods like dehydration, curing, or adding high concentrations of sugar or salt binds the water molecules so they are unavailable to bacteria. If the water activity drops below this 0.85 threshold, the organism effectively becomes unable to draw the resources it needs from the environment. This is why shelf-stable items like dry pasta or beef jerky are significantly safer at room temperature than wet foods. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are moving into the specific biological threats that pose the highest risk to public health, known collectively as the Big Six. To understand why these six pathogens are singled out by regulatory agencies, we must look at both their infectivity and their potential to cause severe systemic disruption in a commercial kitchen. Salmonella typhi originates from human hosts rather than raw animal products, meaning it is strictly transmitted through the fecal-oral route, often by food handlers who have not adhered to proper hygiene. Because it causes typhoid fever, which is a systemic and potentially fatal illness, the regulation mandates that any employee diagnosed with this organism must be excluded from the operation immediately and reported to the local regulatory authority. The survival of this pathogen is noteworthy, as it can remain in a carrier system for weeks or even months after symptoms subside, necessitating a doctor's note and health department clearance before they can return to work. In contrast, non-typhoidal salmonella is commonly associated with poultry, eggs, and dairy, often contaminating products through improper thermal processing or cross-contamination during preparation. While it rarely results in the systemic severity of typhoid fever, its prevalence in the food supply makes it a constant threat that requires rigorous temperature control and surface sanitation. Shiga toxin-producing Escherichia coli, often identified as STEC, is perhaps the most notorious pathogen regarding supply chain contamination, particularly in ground beef. Because these bacteria live in the intestines of cattle, the slaughter process can introduce the organism to the meat surface, where mixing during grinding disperses it throughout the entire mass. This necessitates that all ground beef reaches a minimum internal temperature of 155 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure lethality. Beyond beef, this pathogen frequently appears in contaminated produce, such as spinach or lettuce, due to runoff from agricultural irrigation, and unpasteurized beverages like apple cider. Shigella spp. Behaves similarly to Salmonella typhi, in that it is primarily spread through the fecal-oral route, frequently linked to salads, potato salad, or any ready-to-eat food that requires extensive manual handling during assembly. Because flies can transfer Shigella to food by hovering over contaminated fecal matter and then landing on preparation surfaces, controlling pest populations is an essential component of preventing its transmission. If we focus on the viral components of the Big Six, we encounter norovirus and hepatitis A, both of which are highly contagious and capable of causing significant outbreaks from very small initial viral loads. Norovirus is widely recognized as the leading cause of foodborne illness in the United States, typically transmitted through the vomit or feces of infected people who then touch food or surfaces without washing their hands. It is extremely resilient in the environment and resistant to common sanitizers, meaning that once it enters a facility, physical removal through diligent hand washing is the only effective defense. Hepatitis A, which attacks the liver, often leads to jaundice and carries a much longer incubation period than the rapid onset symptoms of norovirus. Because an infected individual may shed the virus before they even realize they are ill, the mandatory exclusion rules for employees with jaundice or confirmed infections are strictly enforced. The transmission mechanism for both viruses highlights why ready-to-eat food touched by bare hands should essentially never occur in a professional environment, regardless of how clean the handler might appear to be. Managing these organisms is not a matter of luck, but one of consistent, evidence-based systems that remove human error from the equation. When we synthesize the requirements for excluding employees who carry these pathogens, we essentially create a firewall that keeps the illness from reaching the consumer in the first place. You must treat every instance of reported illness as a potential breach that requires verification, because waiting for symptoms to manifest at the guest table is already an operational failure. By maintaining strict protocols for receiving, cooking, and employee hygiene, you turn the science of food safety into a repeatable, defensive strategy that protects your guests and your business. The priority remains clear: prevent the fecal-oral route of transmission, cook high-risk materials to their critical temperature thresholds, and never compromise on the exclusion of personnel who represent a public health risk. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. Today we are beginning our study of how to identify the symptoms of foodborne illnesses in our professional environment. This chapter will provide you with the diagnostic framework necessary to maintain a safe kitchen and protect public health. In any commercial kitchen, the responsibility for identifying the symptoms of foodborne illness falls squarely on the shoulders of the manager. Detecting these symptoms is not merely about observing a sick employee. It is a critical diagnostic process that prevents an outbreak from escalating into a public health crisis. You must be able to distinguish between common, minor ailments and the specific, high-risk symptoms that mandate immediate action. The regulatory standard requires specific reactions when staff members exhibit physiological markers that signify active contamination. When you ignore these, you compromise the integrity of your food safety system and expose your establishment to massive liability. It is helpful to view the symptomatic profile as a set of early warning signs, much like the error logs in a software system that precede a total application failure. By understanding these indicators, you can intervene before a single ill individual impacts the entire consumer base. The symptomatic indicators we focus on are acute diarrhea, projectile vomiting, severe abdominal cramps, high fever, and jaundice. Diarrhea and vomiting are perhaps the most common indicators, but they are also the most frequently misinterpreted as minor, non-contagious issues by inexperienced staff. A high fever, often accompanied by persistent nausea, is another significant marker that requires immediate exclusion from any food handling duties. Jaundice, which manifests as a yellowing of the skin or eyes, is a particularly critical symptom because it is often linked to hepatitis A highly contagious pathogen that must be reported to health authorities immediately. Each of these physiological expressions functions as a diagnostic data point. When a staff member reports any of these symptoms, your role is to document the incident with cold, analytical precision. You are performing a triage function, and underestimating these symptoms creates a vulnerability that risks the health of your customers. Once you identify these symptoms, you must initiate a rigorous protocol that includes incident logging and, in many cases, communication with local epidemiologists. The incident log serves as your evidentiary trail. It should record the date, the specific symptoms reported, the employee's recent duties, and the actions taken by management. Internal traceback procedures should be executed immediately to determine if the individual had contact with ready-to-eat foods or critical kitchen assets. If multiple staff members report the same cluster of symptoms, you are likely facing an active biological outbreak and must escalate your response to the local health department. This communication must be formal, factual, and devoid of ambiguity. Treat the epidemiologist as a subject matter expert who needs accurate, unfiltered data to contain the situation. By maintaining this documentation system, you move from a reactive posture to one of controlled, active management. Understanding these protocols ensures that you can differentiate between standard employee fatigue and a genuine contamination risk. It is rarely beneficial to rely on the employee's self-diagnosis, as they may downplay severe symptoms in order to remain on the schedule. Instead, strictly enforce the reporting requirements and utilize the symptoms as the sole, objective metric for exclusion. The goal is to isolate the risk before it migrates from the individual to the production line. By applying these standards uniformly, you minimize the surface area for a potential pathogen spread. This level of attention is what defines a competent manager, ensuring that your facility remains a closed, safe system. Your ability to consistently map these symptoms against your operational requirements is the primary defense against the inevitable, occasional presence of illness in a human workforce. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today, we are going to explore the critical management of the major food allergens. This module provides the technical knowledge and operational strategies required to comply with modern safety standards and protect your guests from accidental exposure. In the professional kitchen, the challenge of managing food allergens is distinct from microbial safety because we are not dealing with pathogens which can be killed by heat. Instead, we are managing biochemical reactions where even a microscopic protein fragment can trigger a life-threatening immune response in a sensitive individual. The law recognizes an expanding list of major allergens, often termed the Big Nine, which includes milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, soy, wheat, fish, crustacean shellfish, and the recently added sesame. When a person with an allergy consumes these specific proteins, their immune system mistakenly identifies them as harmful invaders, causing a cascade of symptoms ranging from mild hives to severe anaphylaxis. Anaphylaxis is a systemic emergency characterized by a rapid drop in blood pressure, constriction of airways, and potential circulatory collapse. Because there is no medical cure for these allergies, our only defense as managers is strict, uncompromising prevention through operational control. The primary threat to the allergic customer is not intentional inclusion of an ingredient, but rather cross-contact. Cross-contact occurs when an allergen is transferred from a food containing an allergen to a food that does not, rendering the latter unsafe for a guest with a specific sensitivity. This can happen through shared cooking equipment, cooking oil, or even residual protein on a surface that has been wiped but not adequately sanitized. To mitigate these risks, managers must implement dedicated preparation areas whenever possible, or at minimum schedule the preparation of allergen-free meals during times when the kitchen is not crowded. You should maintain isolated storage containers and clearly label these items to prevent accidental inclusion during a busy service period. Never assume that a guest understands your internal kitchen processes, which makes proactive communication the second pillar of your safety strategy. Effective management requires a comprehensive communication loop between the front-of-house staff and the kitchen team. When a guest mentions an allergy, the server must be trained to inform the manager on duty or the chef immediately to ensure that kitchen protocols are activated. It is insufficient to simply omit an ingredient from a plate. The entire preparation process must be scrutinized for potential cross-contact. Label verification is a non-negotiable step because manufacturers often update their formulations or switch suppliers without warning. When you evaluate an ingredient list, you must look for synonyms and hidden sources, such as casein for milk or hydrolyzed vegetable protein, which might contain soy or wheat. Ensuring transparency means maintaining an updated list of all ingredients in every dish, which should be readily available for staff to consult at any moment. Staff training serves as your final, most reliable barrier against common errors that lead to allergic reactions. Employees must be taught that there is no threshold of contamination that is safe. A small scrape of butter or a utensil used to move peanuts constitutes a dangerous event for a highly reactive individual. Conduct regular, rigorous training sessions where the staff learns to identify the Big Nine and practice the specific protocols for cleaning workstations before preparing allergen-free food. Emphasize that requesting clarification from a manager is always the correct behavior when a guest has a special dietary requirement. By fostering a culture of ingredient transparency and meticulous handling, you transform the dining experience from a high-risk activity into a safe environment for everyone. When your systems are properly implemented, your team will intuitively understand that allergen management is a mandatory part of every decision made in the kitchen. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our journey towards certification, where we shift our focus from accidental contamination to the deliberate, malicious tampering of our food supply. In this chapter, we will master the alert system to defend our facilities against intentional threats. While the food safety principles we have covered thus far largely address unintentional contamination like bacteria or cross-contact, we must also consider the deliberate actions of individuals who wish to cause harm. Intentional food contamination is a severe risk that requires a robust, systemic approach rather than simple surface-level sanitation protocols. The FDA developed the ALERT initiative as a specialized framework to allow managers to evaluate and strengthen their security systems against deliberate sabotage. When we talk about these threats, we are looking at chemical, biological, or physical agents introduced into food items at any point in the supply chain to cause injury or death. As managers, your responsibility extends beyond keeping the kitchen clean. It includes maintaining an environment where your supply chain and facility infrastructure remain impenetrable to those with malicious intent. By formalizing our approach through the 5 pillars of alert, we create a defensive posture that makes it significantly more difficult for unauthorized individuals to compromise the integrity of the food we serve to the public. The first pillar of this system is to assure that the products you receive are from safe, reputable, and verified sources. You must hold your suppliers accountable by ensuring they implement their own food defense programs, and you should verify their credentials before entering into any formal purchasing agreement. This means you should always supervise the delivery process rather than leaving the dock unattended, as this is a vulnerable transition point between a vehicle and your secure storage environment. The second pillar requires you to look closely at your physical security, which involves restricting access to sensitive areas like storage rooms, walk-in coolers, and chemical cabinets. You should evaluate your facility design to identify blind spots where an outsider could hide or place a prohibited substance into the food stream. By limiting access to these zones through locked doors and controlled key cards, you naturally decrease the probability of unauthorized tampering going unnoticed. Employees represent both our most valuable asset and a potential vulnerability, which brings us to the third pillar, employees monitoring. Effective food defense necessitates that you conduct thorough background checks during the hiring process to ensure that your team members are trustworthy and properly vetted. You must also establish clear access protocols where individuals are only permitted in areas of the facility that are essential to their specific job function. Beyond physical access, this involves maintaining a culture where managers and supervisors remain hypervigilant regarding unusual behavior or unauthorized personnel lingering in secure parts of the building. The fourth pillar, reports, dictates that your documentation must be comprehensive and easily auditable. This includes maintaining accurate delivery logs, detailed food supply records, and precisely managed staff schedules that effectively track who is in the facility at any given time. These records are not just for inventory management, they serve as a historical footprint that allows investigators to trace the origin of any suspicious activity back to specific time windows and responsible parties. Final pillar focuses on threat response, which ensures that your team is prepared to act immediately if a security breach or suspicious incident occurs. You should develop a clear protocol that outlines who to contact, how to isolate compromised food products, and how to verify the safety of the remaining inventory following an incident. This also involves training your staff to identify and report red flags, such as persons unknown to the facility wandering into the back of house or delivery personnel who are not following established check-in procedures. By encouraging a proactive environment, you enable your employees to function as a human sensor network that can detect and report potential threats before they escalate into an actual contamination event. These 5 pillars provide an airtight infrastructure when applied consistently and monitored by a diligent managerial team. You are shifting from a reactive safety model to an intentional security mindset, which is a fundamental requirement for any manager operating in today's complex supply chain environment. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to our deep dive into the hygiene standards that form the backbone of any professional kitchen. In this lesson, we will establish the exact scientific protocols for hand washing and the structural requirements for hand washing stations. Effective hand washing is not merely a common sense practice, but a rigorous, science-based intervention designed to break the chain of infection. Pathogens are easily transient on human skin, moving from contaminated surfaces, raw proteins, or bodily fluids to ready-to-eat foods through direct contact. To mitigate this risk, regulatory frameworks demand a specific, repeatable procedure that leaves no room for improvisation. The process begins with wetting your hands and arms under running, potable water that must be maintained at a temperature of at least 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal energy combined with the mechanical action of the water helps initiate the removal of surface debris and transient microbes. Once the hands are wet, you must apply an approved antibacterial soap, ensuring that the volume of soap is sufficient to create a proper lather covering all surfaces. The most critical phase of the process is the scrubbing action, which must be performed for at least 10 to 15 seconds. During this time, you must scrub vigorously, paying close attention to the areas between your fingers, beneath the fingernails, and along the forearms. Many individuals fail to scrub the nail beds or the spaces between the digits, yet these are precisely the niches where bacteria reside. After this intensive mechanical scrubbing, the total duration of the process, from wetting to rinsing, must span at least 20 seconds. This duration is not an arbitrary suggestion, but a validated safeguard necessary to disrupt the cell membranes of bacteria and emulsify fats and oils that harbor viruses. Once the scrubbing is complete, you must rinse your hands and exposed arms thoroughly under the warm water, ensuring all residual soap is removed, as soap residue can irritate the skin or leave a chemical taint. After rinsing, the drying phase is equally vital to prevent recontamination and discourage the growth of microorganisms that thrive in moist environments. You must dry your hands and forearms using a single-use paper towel or a high-velocity hand dryer. If you use a paper towel, it is best practice to use that same towel to turn off the faucet to avoid immediate recontamination of your clean hands. High-velocity air dryers are acceptable alternatives, provided the airflow is sufficient to fully dry the skin within a reasonable time frame. By strictly adhering to this 20-second duration and the specific motions required, you are effectively reducing the microbial load on your hands to a level that is considered safe for food handling. Beyond the procedure itself, the integrity of your hygiene program depends on the infrastructure of your hand-washing facilities. A hand-washing sink must be dedicated exclusively to hand washing to prevent cross-contamination from other kitchen activities. It is a strictly prohibited practice to use hand-washing sinks for rinsing food, dumping liquid waste, or washing utensils. The sink must remain accessible at all times, meaning it cannot be blocked by equipment, boxes, or other obstacles that would impede a manager or food handler from performing their duties. Furthermore, the sink must be equipped with both hot and cold running water, and these must be potable, meeting all local safety standards for drinking water. Your facility design must also integrate specific communicative elements to ensure compliance remains at the forefront of every employee's mind. Every hand-washing sink must be clearly marked with signage that reminds employees of their obligation to wash their hands frequently. A trash receptacle must be positioned near the sink to ensure that single-use towels can be discarded immediately after use, preventing them from accumulating on countertops or floors. These stations must be placed in locations that are convenient for every workstation in the kitchen, yet separated from areas where finished food is being plated or held. Maintaining these facilities as dedicated, unobstructed, and well-supplied nodes is a fundamental responsibility of the manager, as they directly dictate the feasibility of your entire personal hygiene program. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of safe personal hygiene practices. In this session, we will examine the precise regulatory requirements for monitoring and reporting employee illness. As a manager, your legal responsibility regarding staff health is absolute and non-negotiable. You are the final line of defense against the introduction of pathogens into your food service operation. The FDA Food Code mandates that food handlers must report specific symptoms and diagnoses to you immediately upon awareness, This is not a suggestion or an internal policy preference, but a core statutory obligation that protects both your customers and the viability of your business. When an employee reports symptoms such as vomiting, diarrhea, or jaundice, you must take immediate, documented action to isolate the risk. Ignoring these reports or failing to maintain a paper trail of these incidents can lead to significant liability and potential closure during a health inspection. The primary symptoms that trigger a mandatory reporting requirement include vomiting, diarrhea, jaundice, and a sore throat accompanied by a fever. If a food handler presents with any of these symptoms, your first step is to assess their role and the potential for food contamination. Vomiting and diarrhea are strong indicators of gastrointestinal distress that could easily spread pathogens through fecal-oral transmission. Jaundice is a particularly critical symptom because it is often a clinical sign of hepatitis A virus that can cause massive outbreaks if transmitted. You must also watch for instances where a staff member reports a diagnosis verified by a medical professional. If an employee is diagnosed with any of the big six pathogens, specifically norovirus, hepatitis A, Shigella, E. coli, non-typhoidal salmonella, or Salmonella typhi, the reporting pipeline changes significantly. Once you've identified a symptomatic employee, you must decide between restriction or exclusion based on the specific condition and the environment. Restricting an employee means that the individual is still permitted to work in your facility, but they are prohibited from activities that involve food contact surfaces, or utensils. This is appropriate for someone who has a sore throat and fever but has been cleared of other communicable diseases. By limiting their scope of work, you effectively isolate the risk while allowing the staff member to perform administrative or non-food related tasks. However, if the risk is high, such as in the case of jaundice or a confirmed diagnosis of the Big Six, you must move to exclusion. Exclusion mandates that the employee is completely prohibited from entering the facility until written medical clearance is obtained. The decision to exclude or restrict is not purely at your discretion. It is governed by clinical criteria and local health authority guidelines. If a food handler is suffering from jaundice, they must be excluded from the operation immediately, and you're often required to report the incident to the local regulatory agency. This ensures that a proper investigation can take place if the cause is linked to a communicable disease that poses a public health threat. Returning an excluded employee to work requires more than just the absence of symptoms. You need formal, written medical documentation stating that the individual is no longer infectious. For certain pathogens, you may also need explicit approval from your local health department to reinstate the employee. Your documentation process must be as rigorous as your decision-making process. Maintain a log that records the date of the report, the specific symptoms described by the employee, the actions taken by management, and the date the employee returned to the workplace. This record is often requested by health inspectors to verify that you are maintaining active managerial control over your staff's health. If an employee claims to be asymptomatic but you suspect they are ill, do not hesitate to ask direct, professional questions about their status. Transparency between management and staff is the only way to manage these risks effectively without creating an adversarial environment. By handling these situations with calm, protocol-driven precision, you ensure compliance and safeguard your operation from the fallout of a preventable illness outbreak. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are now turning our focus to the professional standards required for workplace attire and the direct role your physical appearance plays in maintaining a sanitary food environment. In any professional kitchen, your uniform serves as the first line of defense against the introduction of external contaminants into the food production area. When we talk about professional kitchen work attire, we are not discussing style or personal preference, but rather a structured approach to risk management. Every piece of clothing or accessory worn by a food handler represents a potential vector for pathogens, skin cells, or physical debris to migrate onto contact surfaces and ready-to-eat products. The requirement for daily laundered uniforms is fundamentally rooted in the fact that fabric fibers trap dirt and bacteria throughout a shift. Once these garments are worn, they accumulate environmental hazards that can easily transfer to equipment or food items if hygiene standards are not strictly enforced. By mandating a fresh, clean uniform at the start of every shift, a manager effectively minimizes the mechanical transfer of these unwanted substances. Hair restraints represent another critical component of managing physical contamination hazards. The regulations are unequivocal in their requirement for effective hair coverings, such as caps, headbands, or beard nets, for all employees engaged in food handling. A single loose strand of hair or accidental skin shedding from the scalp can introduce biological or physical hazards that are difficult to detect once they settle into an open food container. Hairnets or caps must fully contain hair to ensure that no contact occurs with food, equipment, or food contact surfaces. Furthermore, the prohibition of hairpins, barrettes, or false eyelashes is a matter of physical safety. These items can easily become dislodged and fall into food, creating an immediate physical choking hazard or a vector for contaminants that have collected on the item during the day. Strict compliance with these standards removes unnecessary variables from the sanitation equation. Jewelry policies within the food service industry are often misunderstood, but they are governed by clear risk assessment principles. You should restrict personal jewelry to a plain, single-band ring, as any other form of adornment presents a significant logistical and sanitary challenge. Decorative rings with settings or other forms of jewelry, such as watches and bracelets, provide tiny crevices where pathogens can harbor and multiply, effectively escaping even the most diligent hand-washing efforts. Moreover, these items can easily snag on equipment or break off, contaminating the food supply in a way that is difficult to remediate instantly. Maintaining a policy that limits jewelry to a simple band minimizes the surface area available for bacterial growth and reduces the risk of physical foreign objects entering the food stream. Professional presentation is therefore synonymous with biological safety. When you enforce these standards, you are not merely checking a box on a compliance list. You are actively controlling the environment in which you prepare food. A kitchen culture that views uniforms and personal grooming as an extension of safety protocols will naturally produce a more reliable output. Managers must lead by example, ensuring that their own attire meets the same rigorous specifications required of their staff. By normalizing these behaviors, the entire team becomes vigilant about preventing the mechanical migration of pathogens from their clothing or bodies to the food supply. This consistency turns the physical layout and the people working within it into a cohesive safety system. Always ensure that your team understands that their clothing is essentially a piece of personal protective equipment designed to guard the customer. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. We are now turning our focus to the professional standards required for utilizing single-use gloves to protect your patrons from foodborne illness. In the professional kitchen environment, single-use gloves serve as a critical barrier between human hands and food products that will not undergo further thermal processing. While hand washing remains the foundational pillar of personal hygiene, gloves provide an additional layer of defense, yet they often create a false sense of security if handled incorrectly. You must understand that gloves are not a substitute for proper hand washing. They are a supplement designed to maintain sanitation during specific tasks. If your hands are contaminated, putting on gloves simply traps those contaminants against the surface of the food you are preparing. Therefore, the procedural rule remains absolute. You must wash and dry your hands thoroughly before donning any pair of single-use gloves. This protocol prevents the transfer of pathogens from the skin surface to the glove material itself, which could then be transferred to the food. The primary application for these gloves involves the handling of ready-to-eat foods, which are items that will not see further cooking, washing, or peeling before reaching the consumer. This category includes prepared salads, sliced fruits, plated desserts, and cooked proteins intended for immediate service. The regulatory requirement is explicit regarding the prohibition of bare hand contact with these foods. This is particularly vital when serving populations that are immunocompromised, such as residents in nursing homes or patients in hospitals, as their systems lack the resilience to fight off common foodborne pathogens. When you are assembling a sandwich, plating a salad, or garnishing a dish, the physical boundary created by the glove must remain intact and sterile. Any moment where you touch your face, your apron, or a non-food surface, you have effectively compromised that barrier and must immediately replace your gloves. Temporal parameters regarding glove changes are just as important as the initial application stage. Even when a task seems clean, you are required to change your gloves after 4 hours of continuous use on the same task. This limit exists because glove materials, such as latex or nitrile, can develop microscopic tears over time, or they may simply become a harbor for bacteria due to the warmth and moisture collecting inside the glove. Beyond the 4-hour rule, event-based changes are mandatory regardless of how much time has passed. You must change your gloves when switching from handling raw proteins like chicken or ground beef to handling ready-to-eat products. Failure to execute this switch is a classic failure point that leads directly to cross-contamination, as pathogens from the raw surface are transferred to the finished product. Furthermore, you must discard your gloves and replace them immediately following any physical interruption that breaks the hygienic cycle. Whether you are performing a task in the kitchen and need to answer a phone, adjust your equipment, or dispose of trash, the integrity of your gloves is lost the moment you engage with external, non-food contact items. Do not attempt to wipe your gloves clean or sanitize them with alcohol-based products, as neither practice restores them to a sanitary state. Sanitizer is meant for skin, not for plastic or latex membranes. The process of removing them requires that you discard them into the proper waste stream, wash your hands again, and then apply a clean, fresh pair. This disciplined approach eliminates the vectors for pathogen transmission and keeps your food preparation workflows compliant with the highest industrial standards. See you in the next lecture. Hello, welcome back. Today, we turn our attention to the operational behaviors that represent silent yet significant threats to a sanitary kitchen environment. In any high-functioning kitchen, the professional integrity of the staff is the primary defense against biological contamination. It is a fundamental truth that human behavior often acts as the most unpredictable variable in food safety, and thus, we must implement rigid, policy-driven constraints to mitigate these risks. We are specifically addressing habits that involve the transfer of saliva or bodily fluids into food preparation areas, such as smoking, chewing gum, or the casual consumption of food and beverages. These activities are not merely social distractions. They are concrete vectors for pathogens like Staphylococcus aureus, which resides naturally in the human mouth and nose. When an employee engages in these activities near open food, they inadvertently aerosolize or physically transfer microscopic droplets into the supply chain. Consequently, management must mandate a total prohibition of eating, drinking, smoking, and the use of tobacco products within designated active food preparation, dishwashing, and open food storage zones. By formalizing these restrictions as non-negotiable operational standards, you eliminate the ambiguity that often leads to accidental contamination events. While the restriction on drinking is absolute in prep areas, we must balance safety with the physical needs of our employees to maintain hydration during long shifts. The solution lies in engineering the environment rather than restricting access to water, which allows for the use of specifically designed covered beverage containers. An acceptable container for the kitchen environment is defined as a cup that possesses a tight-fitting lid and a dedicated, non-reusable straw, which ensures that the liquid remains contained even if the vessel is tipped. This setup prevents the individual from having to touch the mouth contact surface of the container continuously with their hands, which would otherwise introduce pathogens to the food contact surface. Furthermore, the presence of these containers must be restricted to designated areas where they cannot spill into food products or onto clean equipment surfaces. If a staff member is consistently observed drinking from an open can or a bottle that lacks these specific safety features, that container must be treated as a potential contaminant source and removed immediately. Effective management requires constant vigilance, as the convenience of an employee often clashes directly with the standard of biological safety. Beyond oral consumption habits, we must address the management of external bodily integrity, specifically the presence of open or infected wounds. A seemingly minor cut on a hand represents a significant reservoir for dangerous pathogens that can easily migrate to food if left exposed. It is insufficient to merely apply a standard bandage, as common adhesive strips are permeable and offer no real barrier against the proliferation of bacteria under movement. The protocol strictly requires that any open wound on the hands or wrists must be covered first with an impermeable bandage or finger cot, which creates a physical seal against moisture and microbial escape. Following this, the employee must be instructed to wear a single-use glove over that bandage to provide a secondary, clean exterior surface. This layer of protection serves to keep the medical dressing secure and protected from the kitchen environment while also preventing the contamination of the food product. If a wound is actively infected or weeping, it serves as a clear indicator that the individual is currently unfit for direct food handling duties and must be restricted to non-food tasks or excluded from the kitchen entirely to protect the safety of your customers. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of maintaining a controlled biological environment within the commercial kitchen. Today, we are focusing on the precise protocols required to manage employee wounds, ensuring they never become a vector for cross-contamination. In any kitchen environment, the skin acts as an essential barrier between the outside world and the food we prepare, yet this barrier is occasionally compromised by cuts, burns, or abrasions. While these injuries might seem minor from a first aid perspective, they present a significant hazard in food service due to the prevalence of Staphylococcus aureus. This bacterium is commonly found on human skin and in nasal passages, often existing as a harmless commensal organism in healthy individuals. However, when a wound is present, this pathogen can colonize the area and multiply rapidly in the nutrient-rich medium of food once transferred. If an infected lesion or an open cut comes into direct contact with food, the risk of transferring not just the bacteria, but also the heat-stable enterotoxins they produce increases substantially. As managers, our primary duty is to mitigate this biological risk by enforcing strict containment procedures that isolate the injury from the food supply altogether. When an employee reports a wound on the hand, wrist, or arm, your first action must be an objective assessment of whether the injury can be adequately contained. If the wound is deep, actively bleeding, or exhibiting signs of infection such as purulent discharge or localized swelling, the initial protocol is immediate restriction from food handling duties. If the injury is minor and can be securely managed, you must ensure the application of an impermeable barrier. This requires a brightly colored bandage. The color is not merely aesthetic, but a safety feature intended to make the bandage immediately visible should it accidentally fall into a food product. Furthermore, the dressing must be fluid impermeable to ensure that serous fluid or blood cannot leak through to the surface. It is a common mistake to assume a standard fabric bandage is sufficient, but in a professional setting, we require materials that do not absorb moisture and can withstand the rigors of a humid kitchen environment. Once the wound is properly dressed, a secondary reinforced barrier is mandatory to prevent the primary bandage from being dislodged. This is achieved by covering the site with a clean, single-use glove or a finger cot depending on the location of the wound. The logic here is architectural redundancy. The glove acts as a fail-safe layer that keeps the bandage in place while maintaining a clean field of work. If a glove is utilized, you must emphasize that hand washing protocols still apply, and the glove must be changed as frequently as if no wound were present. If at any point the bandage becomes soiled or potentially contaminated, the employee must report it immediately, so the entire process of cleaning, redressing, and regloving can be performed under your supervision. Never allow a staff member to decide for themselves if an injury is sealed. The manager's oversight is the only acceptable standard here. There are scenarios where an injury is located directly on a sensitive area or remains persistently unhygienic, making it impossible to reconcile with food safety standards. In these instances, you must exercise your authority to reassign the employee to tasks that involve zero contact with food, clean equipment, or clean dishware. This might mean shifting them to clerical duties, inventory management in a secure area, or maintenance tasks that do not risk indirect contact with consumables. If no such roles are available within your operation, the only responsible course of action is to excuse the employee from their shift until the wound is healed or can be reliably covered. Managing this involves clear communication about why these rules exist, framing it not as a punishment, but as a commitment to public health that protects both the patron and the restaurant's reputation. Compliance monitoring is the final gear in this safety mechanism, and it requires you to be visible and proactive on the floor. Periodically audit your staff's compliance by observing how they handle their hands and whether any makeshift dressings have appeared that deviate from the standard brightly colored, water-resistant criteria. If you discover an employee with an unauthorized, skin-colored bandage or an uncovered wound, you have identified a critical failure in your active managerial control. Take this opportunity to correct the behavior immediately and reinforce the training, as these small lapses often precede more significant foodborne illness outbreaks. By maintaining an uncompromising stance on wound management, You build a culture where safety is treated with the same technical rigor as recipe execution or temperature control. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we examine the principles of evaluating approved, reputable food suppliers to ensure the integrity of your supply chain. Building a food safety program is not merely about what happens inside your kitchen. It is fundamentally about the inputs you allow through your back door. When you source ingredients, you are effectively extending your trust to the vendor's own manufacturing and sanitation practices. An approved, reputable supplier is defined as one that has been inspected by appropriate federal, state, or local regulatory agencies. These authorities, such as the FDA or USDA, verify that the supplier adheres to current good manufacturing practices, which serve as the baseline for food hygiene. You should never assume that a vendor is safe simply because they have a professional marketing brochure or competitive pricing. Instead, you must perform your due diligence by requesting and reviewing legitimate, up-to-date inspection reports before entering into any supply agreement. If a supplier cannot or will not provide evidence of recent regulatory oversight, you have no objective basis to assume their facility is safe. Beyond regulatory status, a professional manager must assess the logistics of the supply chain, specifically the cold chain management. If you order refrigerated or frozen goods, the supplier must demonstrate that they maintain strict temperature control during transit. You must ask how they monitor their delivery vehicles and what protocols they have in place to prevent temperature abuse during the loading and transport phases. A supplier who cannot prove their cold chain integrity is a high-risk liability for your establishment, regardless of how clean their processing plant might appear. Furthermore, you must establish a policy that strictly prohibits the acceptance of food from unapproved sources, such as home-prepared items or illegally harvested wild products. Including such items in a commercial kitchen introduces uncontrollable variables regarding pathogens, toxins, and allergens that you simply cannot mitigate. There are no safe shortcuts when it comes to the origin of your food supply. Legal liability is an often overlooked aspect of supplier selection, but it remains a critical concern for any manager. When an outbreak occurs, regulators will trace the source of the contamination back to the original producer. If you have purchased items from an unauthorized vendor or an underground source, you generally accept full legal responsibility for the resulting illness or regulatory failure. Being able to demonstrate that you only work with approved suppliers provides you with a necessary layer of protection. This means keeping records of your supplier's information and periodically auditing their compliance status to ensure they remain in good standing. Good manufacturing practices are not static, and a facility that was compliant last year could have drifted into poor habits today. Regular verification ensures that your standards for the quality and safety of your ingredients remain consistent with your operational goals. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to our dedicated examination of the protocols required for the safe receipt of sensitive food shipments. This chapter provides the precise temperature benchmarks you must enforce at the loading dock to prevent the proliferation of foodborne pathogens. Effective temperature management during the receiving process acts as a primary control point to ensure the safety of food entering your establishment. When a delivery truck arrives, you are essentially the last line of defense before a potential hazard is integrated into your inventory. Cold time/temperature control for safety, or TCS foods, must arrive at an internal temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower to remain within the safe zone. Deviation from this baseline indicates that the product has spent too much time in the temperature danger zone, significantly increasing the risk of bacterial growth. You should always use a clean and calibrated thermometer to probe products like raw proteins or processed meats upon arrival. If the temperature exceeds this threshold, you must reject the shipment immediately to maintain your safety standards. Consistency in this evaluation process is non-negotiable for high-volume kitchen operations. Treating these numbers as hard physical laws rather than mere suggestions will protect your business from the catastrophic consequences of foodborne illness. Some items require nuanced temperature criteria based on their biological nature and specific regulatory allowances. For live shellfish, milk, and shucked shellfish, the acceptable receiving temperature is 45 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. However, simply reaching that temperature is not the end of the process. You must ensure these items are cooled to an internal temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower within 4 hours of receipt. This requirement accounts for the unique biological characteristics of these products and prevents the rapid multiplication of microorganisms. Similarly, shell eggs must be received at an ambient air temperature of 45 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. While these numbers differ from standard TCS products, they are equally mandatory for your compliance records. By documenting these temperatures upon delivery, you create a trail of accountability that proves your commitment to food safety standards. Never assume a supplier has conducted these checks with the same rigor you apply in your own kitchen. Hot TCS foods present a different set of challenges and must be received at an internal temperature of 135 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. Heat is your most reliable tool for eliminating pathogens, and maintaining that temperature throughout the transit process is vital for the integrity of your hot menu items. If you receive hot food that has fallen below this threshold, you have no way of knowing how long it has been sitting in the dangerous range where bacteria thrive. Beyond simple temperature checks, you must also be vigilant for physical signs of temperature abuse during transit. Large ice crystals or evidence of fluids on the packaging are clear indicators that the product has been thawed and refrozen at some point. This cycle of thermal stress ruins the quality of the food and indicates a breakdown in the supplier's cold chain management. Rejecting shipments that arrive with these physical symptoms is a fundamental aspect of professional inventory oversight. Packaging integrity is an extension of your temperature control protocols because damaged containers often facilitate contamination. When inspecting a shipment, look specifically for torn labels, crushed boxes, or swollen seals that suggest the item was dropped or stored improperly. A compromised outer container fails to provide the necessary thermal barrier, which accelerates the warming or cooling of the interior product beyond safe limits. Furthermore, water stains or pest activity on the shipping containers are immediate red flags that warrant a full rejection of the shipment. You are responsible for ensuring that the vendor provides high-quality goods that have adhered to the same rigorous safety protocols you enforce inside your facility. If the packaging allows for potential cross-contamination, the temperature of the food inside is ultimately overshadowed by the physical risk posed to your operation. Every entry in your receiving log should reflect both the temperature check and the visual verification of packaging soundness. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the critical protocols for inspecting food packaging upon delivery to ensure that no compromised inventory enters your facility. When a delivery truck arrives at your facility, the receiving area serves as your first line of defense against the introduction of foodborne illness. You should consider the packaging of a food item as a primary barrier against contamination, and any structural failure of that barrier compromises the safety of the product inside. When inspecting canned goods, your focus should be on the structural integrity of the metal. Look specifically for severe dents found along the side seams or at the junction where the lid meets the body, as these deformations indicate a potential break in the airtight seal. Even if a dent appears minor, the damaged seam can create a microscopic opening that allows bacteria to enter. Furthermore, look for bulging or swelling at the ends of the cans, which can be a sign of gas production by Clostridium botulinum, a lethal pathogen. If you find deep rust or any evidence of leakage, the unit must be rejected immediately, regardless of what the exterior of the label might suggest. Beyond canned goods, you must maintain a high level of scrutiny for all dry and refrigerated packaging. Torn bags or damaged secondary containers are often entry points for pests or indicate that the product has been handled roughly during transport, which might have compromised the internal primary packaging. If you notice dampness or water stains on cardboard boxes, do not assume it is just condensation from the delivery truck. Water damage often suggests that the product has been previously thawed and refrozen, which is a major red flag for temperature abuse. When handling refrigerated items that arrive in vacuum-sealed plastic, check for signs of a broken vacuum or pockets of air that should not be there. Leaking fluids are a clear indication of physical damage that necessitates an automatic rejection of the affected units to prevent cross-contamination with other stock. Biological indicators are just as important as physical damage when you are evaluating a shipment. As you conduct your physical inspection, utilize your senses to check for abnormal odors or off colors that suggest early stages of spoilage. If a package feels slimy to the touch, this is often a byproduct of bacterial growth and suggests the item has been held at improper temperatures. You must also be vigilant for signs of pest infestation, which can manifest as tiny chew marks on corners of bags or small deposits that resemble droppings. If you observe any of the issues we have discussed, you must act decisively to maintain the safety of your operation. Do not simply put the damaged items back on the shelf. They need to be tagged, isolated, and stored in a designated reject zone until they can be sent back to the supplier or discarded according to your facility policy. Consistency in this inspection process is an essential component of active managerial control. By treating every delivery as a potential hazard until proven otherwise, you remove ambiguity from the receiving process. Your staff should know exactly what constitutes a red line for rejection so that they do not feel pressured by delivery drivers to accept questionable inventory. This structured approach to receiving not only protects your guests, but also prevents financial losses by ensuring you are not paying for ruined inventory. Take the time to document any rejections in your delivery log, as these records provide valuable data about the reliability of your approved suppliers. By maintaining these high standards, you ensure that only safe, untainted products ever reach your kitchen. See you in the next lesson. Hello, and let's examine the vertical organization principles required to maintain a safe, cross-contamination-free refrigerator environment. When we approach the layout of a walk-in cooler, we are essentially architectural engineers of food safety. Raw juices from meat contain pathogens that, if allowed to migrate, will inevitably contaminate foods situated physically below them. To prevent this, regulations mandate a specific storage hierarchy that is based strictly on the minimum internal cooking temperatures required for each item. By ordering items from top to bottom, based on the heat required to make them safe, we ensure that if a drip occurs, the contaminated substance lands on an item that requires a higher final cooking temperature than the one that dripped. Essentially, we are building a safety net that accounts for the potential failure of containers or accidental spills within the unit. At the very top of your storage hierarchy, you must place ready-to-eat foods. This category includes items like washed produce, cooked proteins, deli meats, or bakery goods that will not receive any further heat treatment. Because these items could be served directly to a customer without additional cooking, the risk of transferring pathogens from raw products via drips or contact is unacceptable. If raw beef juice were to drip onto a plate of cooked chicken, the pathogens would be ingested directly by the consumer. Therefore, these items must be isolated from the raw environment entirely, ideally stored in sealed containers that prevent any surface-to-surface interaction. Directly below the ready-to-eat items, you place whole cuts of seafood and fish. These items generally have a lower minimum internal cooking temperature than ground meats or poultry. Since they require less heat to neutralize potential pathogens, they are placed higher in the fridge to keep them away from substances that might drip from the items below. Moving down again, the third level in our hierarchy is reserved for whole cuts of beef and pork. These muscle meats possess structural integrity that usually limits bacterial presence to the exterior surface, meaning they can be handled with slightly different temperature standards than processed meat products. By grouping these together, you maintain a consistent line of demarcation that your entire staff can easily memorize and observe. The fourth tier of your storage arrangement is designated for ground meats, ground fish, and any injected meats. The process of grinding meat homogenizes the product, potentially moving surface bacteria deep into the center of the mass. This characteristic necessitates a much higher internal cooking temperature because you cannot simply sear the exterior to ensure safety. Placing these at this level provides a functional buffer between whole muscle meats and the most dangerous item in the cooler. Because ground products are more prone to carrying a higher pathogenic load distributed throughout their mass, they must never occupy space above whole cuts. This ensures that any accidental leakage is contained within a tier categorized by similar safety management requirements. Finally, the floor of the cooler or the absolute bottom shelf is reserved for whole or ground poultry. This includes chicken, turkey, duck, and any other type of fowl. Poultry is consistently associated with higher risks of salmonella and other serious foodborne pathogens, requiring the highest minimum internal cooking temperature of all the items we store. By placing these items on the lowest shelf, you ensure that even in a worst-case scenario, absolutely nothing can drip onto your poultry and spread potential pathogens to other areas of the refrigerator. This vertical hierarchy is not merely a suggestion for tidiness. It is a critical system of defense designed to prevent systemic cross-contamination. Adopting this rigorous structure allows any kitchen manager to audit their cooling environment instantly and with total confidence. We will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we examine the first in, first out inventory method, a fundamental practice for maintaining both safety and operational efficiency in your facility. When we talk about inventory management, we are essentially talking about managing risk. The FIFO principle, or first in, first out, is the industry standard for ensuring that food products are used in the order they arrive. If you rely on random selection from your pantry or walk-in cooler, you are inviting spoilage and microbial growth. By requiring that staff always position the oldest items at the front of the shelf and newer shipments toward the back, you create a natural flow of stock that naturally enforces turnover. This isn't just about making your pantry look orderly. It is a critical food safety mechanism that prevents products from sitting in storage long enough to enter their danger zone or reach their expiration point. Consider the mechanical realities of a busy kitchen. Without a consistent rotation, it is easy for a case of lettuce or a container of proteins to get pushed to the back of a shelf, becoming essentially invisible. As these items sit, they provide a stable environment for pathogens to survive and, in some cases, replicate. By strictly enforcing FIFO, you establish a physical habit for your staff that removes human error from the equation. When you mandate that a fresh shipment of milk or raw poultry must be placed behind the existing supply, you ensure that the older product is the one that gets grabbed first during the chaos of a dinner rush. This simple, transparent rule is easier for employees to follow than vague instructions about checking dates manually, and it supports the broader goal of maintaining a clean, high-velocity stock environment. Reducing food waste is a welcome side effect, but the true benefit is the mitigation of microbial proliferation. Every food item has a limited window of freshness, and local health codes often dictate strict discard limits once that window closes. When you fail to rotate stock, you are essentially gambling with your inventory's integrity. If a health inspector finds expired, abandoned items in the back of your cooler, they will rightly conclude that your management systems are lacking. By maintaining a rigorous FIFO system, you demonstrate a commitment to operational compliance while protecting your customers from the risks associated with aged or degraded food items. It is an investment in your kitchen's health that requires constant vigilance but minimal cost. Implementation requires more than just a passing suggestion to your staff. You must design your storage areas so that rotation is physically possible and logical. If your shelves are cramped or poorly lit, your team will take the path of least resistance, which is usually the item closest to the door. Ensure that you have adequate physical space to separate incoming shipments from current stock. And consider adding clear signage that emphasizes the FIFO flow in your primary storage areas. It helps to conduct regular audits where you check the dates on items hidden at the back of shelves to verify that your staff is actually following the protocol. When this rotation process becomes part of your standard operating procedure, it transforms from an extra task into a background habit that protects your patrons and your bottom line. See you in the next lesson. Hello. Let us discuss the critical regulatory requirements for maintaining the safety of ready-to-eat time temperature control for safety foods. When we handle ready-to-eat TCS foods prepared on site, we enter a domain where strict temporal boundaries are the only line of defense against the proliferation of Listeria monocytogenes. Because this specific pathogen is psychrotrophic, meaning it continues to grow even at refrigeration temperatures, we cannot rely solely on the cooling process to keep our inventory safe. Regulatory standards mandate that any such food held for longer than 24 hours must be clearly marked to indicate its shelf life. The rule is straightforward but absolute. These items must be consumed, sold, or discarded within a maximum of 7 days. We designate the day the item was prepared as day 1 in this countdown, and your labeling system must reflect the discard date based on that starting point. If you prepare a dish on Monday, that is your first day, and the 7-day window concludes at the end of the following Sunday. Failure to track these dates with precision creates a significant liability and puts your guests at direct risk of foodborne illness. The complexity increases when you are dealing with composite dishes that combine ingredients prepared at different times, such as a pasta salad involving components prepped on various days. If you build a dish using multiple ingredients, the entire product must be labeled using the earliest preparation date of any individual component. Imagine you are incorporating a sauce made on Tuesday into a pasta blend that was cooled on Wednesday. You have to treat the entire mixture as if it originated on Tuesday. This approach ensures that you never inadvertently extend the shelf life of an older ingredient beyond its safety window by hiding it within a newer preparation. You must physically mark the food container with a label that explicitly states the discard date or the preparation date. This label needs to remain legible throughout the entire storage period, regardless of shuffling within the walk-in cooler. There is no grace period for this regulation, and once the seventh day expires, the food is considered hazardous regardless of its visual appearance or storage temperature. In an active kitchen, managers often struggle with the practical execution of these labels because high-volume production can leave little room for error. You should implement a standardized labeling protocol that avoids ambiguity and ensures every staff member understands the system without needing to guess. If you are using a commercially processed item that you have opened but not prepared from scratch, the 7-day count starts as soon as you open the container, provided you keep it at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. This is a common point of confusion, so be mindful that the remaining shelf life may be shorter than 7 days if the manufacturer's original expiration date is sooner. Always default to the shorter of the two time periods to maintain an acceptable level of food safety stringency. Consistency in these operational procedures is what defines a well-managed kitchen and protects your reputation. The practice of discarding food that has reached the end of its cycle is not merely a waste management policy, but a critical regulatory compliance requirement. If a health inspector identifies products in your cooler that exceed the 7-day mark, they will automatically issue a citation for a violation, even if the food has remained perfectly cold. You must train your team to conduct daily audits of the refrigeration units to identify items approaching their discard date. This active monitoring allows your staff to potentially repurpose items into different dishes before the window closes, provided they are still within the safe range. Once the 7th day hits, the only correct action is immediate removal and disposal to prevent any risk of cross-contamination or accidental service. Compliance with these tracking requirements is a binary state. You are either following the safety standards or you are introducing preventable risks into your operation. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the 4 regulatory-approved methods for safely thawing time/temperature control for safety foods. The central challenge when thawing frozen foods is preventing the outer layers from entering the temperature danger zone, generally defined as the range between 41 and 135 degrees Fahrenheit. When pathogens are allowed to reach these temperatures, they can multiply rapidly, potentially reaching levels that cause illness even if the food is subsequently cooked. The most common and safest method is to thaw food inside a refrigeration unit maintained at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. This approach requires advanced planning, as the process is slow, but it provides the highest level of safety by ensuring the entire product remains at a safe temperature throughout the duration of the thaw. You must always place the food in a container or on a tray to catch any potential drips, which prevents cross-contamination of other products stored in the refrigerator below. This method is the industry gold standard for large items like frozen turkeys or large roasts that would otherwise prove difficult to manage safely. A secondary method involves using running water, which requires specific environmental conditions to be considered compliant with food safety regulations. You must submerge the food completely under cold, running, potable water at a temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. It is essential that the water flow has sufficient velocity to agitate the food, which helps flush away loose particles and accelerates the heat transfer process. You must never allow the internal temperature of the food to exceed 41 degrees Fahrenheit for more than 4 hours, a total duration that includes all time spent beneath the water, food preparation, and subsequent cooking. This approach requires constant supervision of the flow rate and temperature, as a stagnant water bath would quickly allow the exterior of the item to warm into the danger zone. Always ensure that the sink used for this process is cleaned and sanitized before and after contact to maintain an appropriate level of environmental control. You may also use a microwave oven for thawing, but this method is governed by very strict operational criteria. The microwave must be used exclusively to thaw food as a direct, continuous, and uninterrupted lead-in to the primary cooking process. Once the microwave cycle concludes, you must immediately transfer the food to the cooking equipment to ensure that no parts of the item remain in the danger zone for an extended period. If you do not plan to cook the item immediately upon completion of the microwave thaw, this method is strictly prohibited and constitutes a violation of standard food safety practices. This technique is typically reserved for smaller portions or individual items rather than bulk products, as the uneven heating patterns in microwaves can leave some areas frozen while cooking others. Relying on this method for large items often results in poor quality and a failure to meet the necessary safety thresholds required by health inspectors. The final approved method allows you to thaw food as an integrated step of the conventional cooking process. This is only permissible when the item is small enough that the heat of the cooking appliance can penetrate the core temperature requirements within an appropriate time frame. Common examples include frozen ground beef patties or small vegetables placed directly into a hot pan or a convection oven for cooking. By skipping the preliminary thawing stage, you eliminate the risk of bacterial multiplication that occurs when a product sits at room temperature or even in a refrigerator for extended periods. However, you must carefully monitor the process to ensure that the item reaches its necessary minimum internal cooking temperature throughout the entirety of its mass. If the food is too large to heat evenly, such as a whole dense roast, trying to cook it from frozen can lead to unsafe surfaces despite an adequately cooked interior, which is why this method is reserved for items of a specific size and composition. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will examine the precise thermal thresholds required to eliminate pathogens from various food products. Achieving the correct internal temperature is perhaps the most significant step in preventing foodborne illness. When we speak about cooking temperatures, we are essentially talking about the margin of safety that separates a wholesome meal from a potential outbreak. Pathogens like Salmonella or E. coli possess varying levels of heat resistance based on the biological structure of the food they inhabit. A liquid soup conducts heat differently than a dense roast, and the fat content in ground meat provides a protective barrier that necessitates higher heat to ensure thorough penetration. The standards we use are grounded in the requirement to maintain a specific equilibrium temperature for a set duration, typically 15 seconds, to achieve a log reduction of bacteria that makes the food safe for consumption. You must treat these numbers as non-negotiable operational requirements rather than suggestions. We start at the top of the range, at 165 degrees Fahrenheit. This temperature is required for all poultry, including chicken, turkey, and duck, regardless of the cut or preparation method. This standard also applies to stuffing made with fish, meat, or poultry, as well as casseroles and any potentially hazardous foods that are being reheated for hot holding. The rationale for this specific target is simple. Poultry is uniquely susceptible to high loads of salmonella, and the internal structure often contains areas that are difficult for heat to reach uniformly. By holding this temperature for 15 seconds, we ensure that the thermal energy destroys the pathogens deep within the muscle tissue. This requirement is absolute, and there is no room for variance when dealing with these specific categories. Next here is 155 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the standard for ground meats such as hamburger or sausage, as well as injected or mechanically tenderized meats. The reason we require a higher temperature for these items compared to a whole steak is the process of preparation itself. When you grind meat, you are taking surface microorganisms and distributing them throughout the entire mass of the product. Therefore, the interior of a patty can be contaminated just as easily as the exterior. Similarly, when a piece of meat is injected with brines or mechanically tenderized by breaking muscle fibers, the process introduces external contaminants into the deep structure of the muscle. Because the risks are widely dispersed throughout the finished product, the internal temperature must be higher to ensure a total kill rate of the target organism. For many of the products typically found on a high-end menu, the required minimum internal temperature is 145 degrees Fahrenheit. This applies to individual whole cuts of beef, pork, veal, and lamb. Unlike ground meat, the risks associated with these whole muscles are generally concentrated on the surface rather than inside the interior muscle. As long as you cook the outer layers thoroughly, the risk of survival for interior pathogens is significantly lower in intact cuts. This category also encompasses seafood, including finfish and shellfish, as well as commercially raised game. Maintaining this temperature for 15 seconds provides the intended microbial reduction while preserving the texture and quality attributes that patrons expect from these higher quality proteins. Finally, we must address the baseline of 135 degrees Fahrenheit, which applies to commercially processed, ready-to-eat foods that will be held hot for service, as well as fruits, vegetables, grains, and legumes. Since many of these items do not carry the same high-risk pathogen profiles as raw animal proteins, the thermal requirement is lower, yet still essential for inhibiting the growth of spore-forming bacteria that thrive in the temperature danger zone. If you are preparing plant-based items for hot holding, you are not necessarily cooking them to destroy high levels of bacteria, but rather to ensure the food remains outside the range where microbial proliferation is rapid. Using a calibrated bimetallic stemmed thermometer is the only way to verify these temperatures accurately, as sensory checks like visual color changes or texture are unreliable proxies for actual internal heat levels. You must calibrate your equipment regularly, as a thermometer that provides a false reading is essentially useless when it comes to maintaining your critical control points. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to this lesson on the two-stage cooling process, where we will examine the scientific requirements for safely reducing the temperature of hot foods. Mastering these protocols is essential for preventing the rapid growth of pathogens that thrive in the temperature danger zone. When we handle large quantities of food that require cooling, we are essentially managing a race against time and biology. Bacteria like Clostridium perfringens and Bacillus cereus multiply most rapidly between 135 degrees Fahrenheit and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is why the regulatory framework places such a heavy emphasis on the first 2 hours of the cooling process. The mandatory requirement is to bring the internal temperature of food from 135 degrees Fahrenheit down to 70 degrees Fahrenheit within this initial 2-hour window. If the food does not reach 70 degrees within those 2 hours, you must either reheat it to 165 degrees and begin the process again, or discard it entirely. There is no middle ground here because the risk of toxin production becomes unacceptable if the cooling time is extended beyond this narrow limit. As a professional, you are responsible for monitoring this progress and ensuring that your staff understands that thermal inertia in large containers often works against safety goals. Once food reaches the 70-degree threshold, the clock does not reset, but the requirements shift for the next phase. You then have a subsequent 4-hour window to drop the temperature from 70 degrees Fahrenheit down to 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. This gives you a total of 6 hours to take a product from its hot cooking temperature to a safe refrigerated state. If at any point the food is not moving through these stages at the mandated speed, you have failed a critical control point in your food safety management system. Much like technical debt in a code base, improper cooling creates a hazardous state that is difficult to remediate once the pathogens have established a foothold. We must treat these time windows as hard constraints that govern our kitchen operations regardless of the volume of product being processed. To achieve these cooling benchmarks consistently, you must employ specific cooling tools and techniques that facilitate rapid heat transfer. Placing a large, uncovered stock pot of chili directly into a walk-in cooler is rarely effective, as the insulating properties of the pot and the density of the food will prevent the center from cooling in time. Instead, we should break large batches down into smaller, shallower stainless steel containers to increase the surface area exposure to the cold air. Another highly effective method is the use of an ice water bath, where you nest a smaller container of hot food into a larger container filled with ice and water, stirring occasionally to distribute the cold energy. You might also utilize ice paddles, which are plastic vessels filled with water and frozen. These paddles act as internal heat sinks when stirred through liquid foods like sauces or soups. Blast chillers can also be utilized in operations that have the budget and infrastructure, as they are specifically engineered to force cold air around food products to meet these strict time limits. It is vital to remember that these cooling requirements are not mere suggestions. They are the result of extensive empirical data regarding bacterial growth kinetics. A common error is assuming that placing food in a residential-grade refrigerator will suffice, but home appliances lack the recovery rate and air circulation capacity required for large volumes of hot food. If you work in a high-volume environment, you must account for the load your cooling equipment can handle without internal temperatures rising above safe levels. Always document the cooling process, checking the center of the densest part of the food with a calibrated thermometer. If the cooling process exceeds the 6-hour mark, the food must be discarded, as no amount of subsequent reheating will destroy the heat-stable toxins that may have already formed. Consistency in this process ensures that your operations remain compliant and, more importantly, keeps your customers protected from preventable foodborne illnesses. We'll see you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome back. Today, we are focusing on the precise requirements for reheating previously cooked and cooled TCS foods to prepare them for safe hot holding. When we handle time and temperature controlled for safety, or TCS, foods that have been previously cooked and cooled, we encounter a significant biological risk. Pathogens can potentially survive the initial cooking process or contaminate the food during the cooling cycle. Storing these foods at temperatures within the danger zone, between 41 degrees Fahrenheit and 135 degrees Fahrenheit, allows bacteria to proliferate rapidly. To safely return these items to a hot holding service, we must employ a reheating process that effectively kills these microorganisms. The regulation is quite rigid here because we are not simply warming food to a palatable temperature. We are performing a safety intervention that must be executed with technical precision. Failure to reach these targets means the food remains an active hazard for your customers. The established federal requirement for reheating TCS foods intended for hot holding is to reach an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 15 seconds. It is important to note that this requirement applies specifically to foods that have been previously cooked and cooled on site. The process must be continuous and thorough, ensuring the heat penetrates the thermal center of the product. Monitoring this is not an optional suggestion. It is a critical control point that requires the use of a calibrated probe thermometer. You should never guess if the food has reached this temperature by visual inspection or touch, as those methods are fundamentally unscientific and prone to error. Accurate measurement ensures that the often dormant bacterial spores or vegetative cells do not survive the transition back into the holding phase. Beyond the required temperature, we must also consider the temporal constraints of this process. The entire reheating cycle, from the moment you start applying heat to the moment the food hits the 165-degree mark, must not exceed a period of 2 hours. This 2-hour window is a strict threshold designed to minimize the time food spends in the danger zone, where bacterial multiplication is most aggressive. If the process takes longer than 2 hours, the food must be discarded, as the growth of pathogens would have reached levels that simple reheating cannot mitigate. Maintaining this speed requires that your staff understands the workflow and prepares the food in sufficiently small portions to facilitate rapid, even heating. Planning is essential because trying to reheat mass quantities of food in a single batch often leads to uneven heat distribution and failure to meet these rapid time requirements. One common operational error is attempting to use hot holding equipment, such as steam tables or soup warmers, to perform the reheating process. These pieces of equipment are designed to maintain the temperature of food that is already hot, not to elevate the temperature of cold food. Because hot holding equipment typically lacks the power to raise the internal temperature of cold TCS food rapidly, it will inevitably keep the food in the danger zone for far too long. This creates a situation that is essentially an incubator for foodborne pathogens. Instead, you must utilize heavy-duty, high-heat cooking equipment like ovens, stovetops, or microwaves to reach the required temperature quickly and safely. Once the food has reached 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds, it can then be moved to the appropriate holding equipment to maintain its status for service. In practice, this means your kitchen protocol must treat reheating as a high-stakes preparation step. You should verify that your equipment is functioning correctly and that your staff members understand that reheating is a recovery method with limited tolerance for variables. Always document the temperature checks when performing this task to demonstrate active managerial control. If a batch of food fails to hit the internal temperature within the 2-hour limit, it must be thrown away immediately, as there is no secondary recovery option for food that has already exceeded the safety limits. Consistent application of these standards protects the health of your diners and ensures your facility remains in compliance with strict food safety regulations. By integrating these practices into your daily operations, you effectively remove the risk associated with carryover items. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our discussion on maintaining the integrity of our temperature control systems. In this session, we will focus exclusively on the technical requirements for calibrating your kitchen thermometers to ensure they remain reliable tools. Accurate temperature measurement is not merely a suggestion in a food service environment. It is a fundamental requirement for safety and regulatory compliance. Every bimetallic, stemmed, or digital thermometer in your kitchen functions as a precision instrument that can drift over time due to repeated use or physical trauma, such as being dropped on a hard floor. To maintain an acceptable margin of error, which the industry standard defines as plus or minus 2 degrees Fahrenheit, you must establish a routine calibration schedule. If a thermometer fails to register the correct temperature during a verification test, it is not simply broken, but rather misaligned with physical reality. Managing this equipment effectively requires a disciplined approach, as the health of your diners depends on the data you collect during routine production and storage checks. By validating your instruments regularly, you demonstrate active managerial control, ensuring that your internal records are based on verified facts rather than assumptions. When performing the ice point method, you are leveraging a stable physical constant to reset your device. You must fill a large container with crushed ice and treat it with just enough clean, cold water to create a thick, drinkable slush. Submerge the sensing area of your thermometer probe into the center of this mixture, making sure the probe does not touch the bottom or sides of the container, as these surfaces can be colder or warmer than the actual ice-water equilibrium point. Wait for the indicator needle or digital readout to stabilize, which usually takes about 30 seconds, and identify the deviation from 32 degrees Fahrenheit. If the display shows a value other than this mark, use a small tool to hold the calibration nut underneath the thermometer head and rotate the dial until the indicator rests exactly at 32 degrees. Digital thermometers often require a specific reset button hold, which provides a more automated way to signal to the internal processor that the current environment is the reference state. The boiling point method offers a different way to validate accuracy, though it requires adjustments based on your specific geographic elevation. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit strictly at sea level, but this temperature decreases as you move to higher altitudes because the atmospheric pressure is lower. For every 500 feet of elevation above sea level, your boiling point threshold will drop by approximately 1 degree Fahrenheit. You should boil a deep pot of clean water, and once the water reaches a rolling, consistent boil, submerge the thermometer probe into the water without touching the edges of the vessel. Again, allow the thermometer to stabilize before reading the results, and adjust the device accordingly so that it aligns with the expected boiling temperature for your specific altitude. While this method is equally sound as the ice point method, most managers prefer the ice point approach because it is safer for staff to handle and does not carry the same risk of steam burns. Operational habits determine how long your calibration remains valid, so you must mandate strict rules regarding how these tools are handled during a shift. Before every use, you must ensure that your thermometer probe is cleaned and sanitized with an appropriate solution or wipe to prevent the introduction of cross-contamination from one food item to another. When measuring the temperature of whole proteins, such as a roast or a large piece of fish, always insert the probe into the thickest part of the food to obtain the most representative thermal data. You should record these checks in a dedicated temperature log, which serves as your primary defense during a health inspection to show that you are consistently monitoring critical control points. If at any point a thermometer shows significant damage or fails to hold its calibration across multiple attempts, you must remove it from service immediately. Reliable data can never be derived from faulty equipment, and replacing a compromised thermometer is always a more sound financial investment than accepting the risks associated with improper temperature monitoring. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we are exploring the regulatory requirements for high-risk food preparation methods that mandate a formal variance permit from your local health authority. In the landscape of modern professional kitchens, standard preparation procedures are often insufficient for certain specialized culinary techniques. When you decide to implement processes that involve smoking food for preservation, curing meats, or using additives like nitrites to extend shelf life, you are venturing into territory that regulatory agencies categorize as high risk. These methods, along with custom processing wild game, sprouting seeds or beans, and hosting live shellfish display tanks, bypass standard safety expectations and introduce unique microbial hazards. Consequently, health departments require a formal document, known as a variance, before you are permitted to proceed. This is not merely a bureaucratic checkbox. It is a legal acknowledgement that you have identified specific risks and implemented robust, scientifically validated controls to mitigate them. By treating these techniques with the necessary administrative rigor, you transform them from potential liability points into controlled, safe operational components of your food service program. One of the most consequential categories requiring a variance is reduced oxygen packaging, often abbreviated as ROP, which includes techniques such as vacuum packaging or sous vide cooking. By removing oxygen from the packaging environment, you inhibit the growth of aerobic spoilage organisms, which creates a deceptive appearance of freshness while simultaneously inviting the proliferation of anaerobic pathogens like Clostridium botulinum. Unlike typical foodborne pathogens, these bacteria thrive in oxygen-deprived environments and are particularly dangerous because they do not necessarily alter the smell or appearance of the food. To gain approval for ROP, a manager must demonstrate a deep understanding of the associated risks and provide a hazard analysis critical control point, or HACCP, plan. This documentation must explicitly detail how you intend to control the growth of pathogens through stringent time-temperature monitoring, ensuring that the packaging process is never an isolated event, but a continuous system of verification. If you cannot provide a detailed, actionable plan for how you monitor temperatures and document outcomes, your application for a variance will almost certainly be denied by the health department. The essence of managing a variance permit lies in your ability to maintain meticulous, automated, or diligent manual logs that provide a clear audit trail of your safety practices. When you engage in specialized processes like curing meats or cold smoking, you are manipulating the biological equilibrium of the food, and your logs serve as the ultimate evidence of compliance during an inspection. You must define the critical limits for every step of these processes, such as the exact acidity levels for certain pickles or the precise heat application for smoking, and log every instance that deviates from these parameters. Regulators are looking for objective data, not anecdotal accounts. So your record-keeping systems should ideally be integrated into your standard operating procedures. This might involve digital temperature logging for sub-zero freezers holding vacuum-packed items or physical charts that track the curing duration of specific animal products. Because the consequences of a failure in these high-risk methods can be severe, the mandate for documentation is absolute and non-negotiable. Finally, realize that the process of obtaining a variance is an ongoing commitment to transparency with your local regulatory body. Once you receive approval, the document is typically tethered to your physical location and the specific equipment you described in your initial application. Should you choose to purchase an upgraded vacuum sealer or change your smoking wood source, you must reevaluate your HACCP plan to determine if it remains accurate and effective. Failing to notify regulators of these changes can invalidate your entire safety framework and leave you vulnerable during a surprise inspection. Always maintain your variance permit within your food safety management system binder, easily accessible to all staff members who handle these specialized products. By ensuring that your team understands the specific requirements of the variance, not just the cooking technique, you foster a culture where administrative compliance supports rather than hinders your culinary innovation. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back to our exploration of safe food serving operations. In this lesson, we will establish the strict parameters required for maintaining safe internal temperatures for hot and cold food during presentation windows. When we talk about holding food, we are essentially managing the growth potential of microorganisms within the context of time and temperature. The primary mandate for hot TCS food, that is time and temperature control for safety food, is to maintain an internal temperature of 135 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. By keeping food at this thermal threshold, we effectively inhibit the growth of vegetative bacteria that would otherwise thrive in the danger zone. It is a simple, binary state of operational control, where failing to reach that specific number puts the product in jeopardy. Conversely, when handling cold TCS food, our objective shifts to slowing down microbial reproduction rather than outright inhibition. For these items, the internal temperature must remain at 41 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. These specific thermal boundaries serve as the critical control limits that define whether a food item is safe for consumption or whether it has become a potential vehicle for foodborne illness. Achieving these temperatures is only half of the battle because we must also prove that these temperatures are consistent throughout the entire service period. Operational controls dictate that managers must verify these conditions by logging temperatures at specific intervals. The regulatory minimum is to check the internal temperature of food at least every 4 hours. Yet this is often a reactive stance rather than a proactive one. If you perform a check at the 4-hour mark and discover that the food has drifted out of the safe range, you have essentially lost the window for corrective action. The item must be discarded because we cannot definitively state how long it resided in the temperature danger zone. By adopting a more rigorous internal policy of checking temperatures every 2 hours, you create a buffer for safety. This 2-hour interval allows for active intervention, meaning if you find a product trending toward a dangerous temperature, you still have time to reheat or chill the item before it completes the full 4-hour risk window. Consistency requires that every member of your team understands the mechanics of how these measurements are taken. You should be utilizing clean, sanitized, and calibrated thermometers to probe the thickest part of the food being held. Mere guesswork regarding the setting on a steam table or the efficiency of a refrigeration unit is not a substitute for data gathered at the product level. You must treat every temperature log as a formal record of your commitment to food safety protocols. When these records are accurate and frequent, they provide defensible evidence during a health department inspection that your facility is maintaining active managerial control. If you find your equipment struggling to maintain these thresholds, it is time to reassess your operational practices or your hardware capacity. Safe food handling is never a matter of opinion or estimation. It is entirely a matter of precisely following these established temperature limits to protect the people we serve. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of food safety, where today we focus on the specific regulatory exceptions for serving food without active temperature controls. In the standard operational environment, time and temperature control for safety, or TCS, foods demand constant thermal maintenance to inhibit the proliferation of pathogens. However, the FDA Food Code permits specific narrow deviations from these requirements under strictly defined conditions. As a manager, you must treat these as absolute boundaries rather than suggestions, as any movement outside these parameters inherently places your operation into a zone of high biological risk. When you choose to forego active heating or cooling equipment for displays, such as in buffet lines or off-site catering, you are essentially gambling with the lag phase of bacterial growth. This practice is permissible only if you have a written procedure in place that is approved by your jurisdiction and if you adhere to rigorous tracking mechanisms. If your operation cannot guarantee that these tracking and discard protocols are followed with mathematical precision, you should default to standard holding practices without hesitation. For cold food, the regulations provide a window of up to 6 hours, provided that the initial temperature of the food is at or below 41 degrees Fahrenheit when it is removed from refrigeration. You must ensure that the food does not exceed 70 degrees Fahrenheit at any point during that 6-hour time frame. It is a common misconception that this is a suggested range, but in reality, if the internal temperature of the food hits 71 degrees, it must be discarded immediately, regardless of how much time remains on the clock. You're also required to track the time precisely, using labels or other verifiable records that clearly indicate the exact moment the food was taken out of temperature control. Once those 6 hours are finished, the food must be discarded, as it has been exposed for a duration that could allow for the potentially dangerous growth of microorganisms. This is not a scenario where you can simply re-chill the food and try again, as the biological clock has already been effectively wound. Serving hot food without temperature control is even more restrictive, as you're limited to a maximum window of 4 hours. Similar to the cold holding exception, the food must be held at 135 degrees Fahrenheit or higher immediately prior to being removed from the thermal unit. You must record the time at which the food was pulled from the heating source, and like the cold food protocol, the food must be served or discarded within that 4-hour block. If the temperature of the food drops below 135 degrees, you might be tempted to reheat it, but the regulations dictate that the time has already commenced, and the 4-hour limit remains the absolute ceiling. Documenting the product, the time of removal, and the designated discard time is mandatory for compliance during health inspections. Many managers fail here because their tracking methods are haphazard. A verbal agreement among staff is simply insufficient for regulatory standards. You must ensure that the process is robust enough to survive a turnover of staff or an unexpected increase in service volume. The core principles here rely on the relationship between time and the growth potential of pathogens like Staphylococcus aureus or Bacillus cereus. which can thrive when food spends too much time in the temperature danger zone. By limiting the duration of exposure, you are intentionally checking the growth cycle, but this relies entirely on the accuracy of your starting temperature and time records. If you do not have the equipment to monitor these variables effectively, you are effectively flying blind and violating the fundamental tenets of active managerial control. Furthermore, if you're displaying multiple batches of the same item, each batch must be tracked individually, or you must treat the entire collective display as starting as soon as the first item was removed. This complexity often makes the exception rules more trouble than they are worth, which is why most high-volume operations prefer to stick to standard holding practices. Always lean toward caution. The legal and safety consequences of a foodborne illness outbreak far outweigh the convenience of an auxiliary display table. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will focus on the specific physical handlings and operational behaviors that define sanitary food service to ensure front-of-house staff prevent cross-contamination during active guest interactions. Maintaining a barrier between human contact and food contact surfaces is the primary defense against pathogen transfer in the dining area. Servers and busser staff must understand that their hands, while seemingly clean, act as vehicles for microbes if they touch specific zones of serviceware. You should train your team to hold plates by the bottom edge or the plate's exterior rim, ensuring their fingers never graze the area where food will be placed. Similarly, glassware must be handled exclusively by the stem or the base, as touching the upper rim introduces saliva-borne bacteria directly into a guest's beverage. These contact points are what we often call food contact surfaces, and they must remain strictly off-limits to bare hands. By enforcing this discipline, you eliminate the risk of transferring staphylococci or other pathogens from an employee's skin to the guest's meal. Professional service standards are fundamentally rooted in this technical separation of the handler from the surface intended for consumption. Beyond plate handling, the way your staff manages tools and ice during service cycles is equally critical to maintaining a sanitary environment. A common vector for contamination is the use of glassware to scoop ice. Glass is fragile and can chip into the ice supply, while the glass surface itself is often handled by staff, thereby contaminating the bin. Instead, always mandate the use of a dedicated, clean ice scoop stored in a protected holder outside of the ice machine or in a designated sanitary location. Serving utensils, such as tongs or ladles, should never be stored in the food product itself if the handle can fall into the food, as the handle is a high-touch point that carries contaminants. If a utensil must be stored in the product, that product must be held at a temperature that prevents bacterial growth, and the utensil handle must extend well above the food line to prevent hand contact with the ingredient. Establishing these workflows transforms service from a chaotic environment into a controlled, sanitary system. The final pillar of front-of-house hygiene involves strict policies against the recycling of items that have already reached a guest's table. Once a plate, garnish, or bowl of condiments enters the dining area and is placed before a guest, it is considered compromised and must never be reserved to another customer. This includes items like bread baskets, preset butter, or opened condiment ramekins that were left untouched, as there is no way to verify those items were not contaminated by the previous guest's proximity or accidental contact. Reserving these items is a violation of basic food safety principles and poses a significant risk to the next guest. Your inventory management should account for these items as waste, and staff should be instructed to clear and discard all used serviceware immediately. Adhering to these firm boundaries regarding plate waste and opened items keeps your operation compliant and protects your guests from hidden health risks. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the specific procedural requirements necessary to maintain sanitary conditions within self-service buffet areas. When we transition from a controlled kitchen environment to a self-service buffet line, the risk profile shifts significantly because the responsibility for food hygiene is partially transferred to the consumer. As a manager, your primary objective is to implement structural and procedural systems that prevent contamination before it occurs. The most fundamental requirement is the installation of sneeze guards or protective displays that shield food surfaces from direct exposure to consumer breath, hair, or physical contact. These guards must be positioned at an appropriate height and angle to physically block airborne droplets, while still allowing guests reasonable access to the service items. Relying solely on staff supervision is insufficient. You must rely on engineering controls that function independently of customer awareness or behavior. By creating this physical barrier, you effectively minimize the risk of biological contaminants moving from the consumer to the food products. Managing the interactions between guests and the food involves enforcing strict rules regarding utensils and plate usage. Every individual food pan must be equipped with its own dedicated serving utensil, such as a long-handled spoon or tongs, to prevent cross-contamination between different menu items. It is vital that these utensils are designed to keep the handle out of the food itself, as a handle resting inside a pan of salad or soup is a primary vector for contamination. Furthermore, you must establish and communicate a clear policy regarding the reuse of plates. Guests are explicitly required to use a fresh, clean plate whenever they return for a second or subsequent trip to the buffet line. This prevents the transfer of potential pathogens from dirty silverware or remnants of food on a used plate back into the public food supply. These procedures are not mere suggestions, but mandatory operational protocols that ensure the continued safety of the service environment. Passive barriers and serving rules must be supported by constant vigilance regarding the temperature of the food being held. Just as with kitchen stations, buffet items must be monitored frequently to ensure they remain safely outside the temperature danger zone. Cold food must be maintained at or below 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and hot food must be held at or above 135 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the duration of the service. Managers should document these temperatures at regular intervals to verify that the equipment is functioning correctly and that the warming or cooling elements are not failing under load. If temperatures fall outside of these safe ranges, food must be discarded or reheated according to established food safety protocols. The presence of a consumer in the area does not excuse a lapse in temperature logging, as biological pathogens do not pause their growth just because a serving line is active. Finally, we must address the human component of buffet service, which includes discouraging guests from using personal items to interact with the food. It is a common, albeit dangerous, practice for consumers to attempt to use their own spoons or forks to sample items, which introduces direct oral contamination into communal containers. Staff must be trained to proactively monitor the buffet and courteously intervene if they observe restricted behaviors, such as a customer placing personal property or non-sanitized items into the food display. Keeping a clean and safe buffet is a continuous process of management, requiring clear signage, adequate staffing, and the consistent enforcement of the rules we have discussed today. By integrating these physical barriers, utensil protocols, and temperature management strategies, you create a system that protects the consumer even when the environment is largely out of your direct, hands-on control. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we examine the structural and procedural barriers required to eliminate cross-contamination vectors within a professional kitchen environment. Cross-contamination represents one of the most significant risks to food safety, acting as a bridge for pathogens to move from raw, contaminated items to surfaces or food meant for immediate consumption. The primary objective is to interrupt these mechanical pathways through strict physical and procedural segmentation. You should view your kitchen not as a single uniform workspace, but as a collection of distinct zones defined by the nature of the tasks occurring within them. When we talk about raw animal proteins, we are essentially talking about items that carry an inherent load of biological hazards. To contain these threats, you must mandate the use of dedicated prep tables that are never utilized for ready-to-eat items like salad greens or cooked proteins. This physical separation prevents the accidental drippage or splashing of raw juices onto finished components. If your kitchen layout does not allow for entirely separate physical rooms, you must rely on temporal separation, where tasks are performed at different times with a complete sanitation cycle occurring between the two. Color-coded systems serve as an excellent administrative control to manage these vectors effectively. By assigning specific colors to boards and utensils for poultry, beef, seafood, and produce, you create a visual language that employees can follow intuitively. This system is designed to minimize cognitive load. An employee reaching for a green cutting board for vegetables is signaled immediately if they possess that board in the raw poultry station. However, color coding is merely a tool, not a substitute for sound judgment. So the equipment must be properly cleaned and sanitized after every single use, as well as after any interruption in the workflow. Relying solely on color coding without a rigorous training program often leads to complacency, where staff might use a poultry board for produce, assuming that because it was rinsed, the risk is negated. Sanitation must involve an approved chemical solution or high-temperature method that effectively kills pathogens rather than just physically displacing them from one corner of a table to another. Employee movement is another critical vector that often goes unnoticed in traditional food safety planning. Workers who handle raw proteins should ideally remain in their designated stations to prevent the spread of contamination via clothing, hair, or hands. If a worker must move from the raw prep zone to the plating area, they are legally and procedurally required to remove their apron, wash their hands thoroughly, and potentially change their gloves. Even if the individual feels they have been careful, the microscopic environment of a raw prep area contains aerosols and droplets that settle on surfaces and attire. Establishing a clear flow of work ensures that finished products do not cross the path of waste or raw, unprocessed materials. By strictly controlling these pathways and implementing clear protocols for every transition between tasks, you create a robust system that relies on architectural and behavioral barriers rather than just individual vigilance. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the logistical complexities of transporting food for off-site catering while maintaining rigorous food safety standards. When moving food from a controlled kitchen environment to a remote location, the primary risk involves the loss of temperature control during transit. You must utilize equipment specifically engineered for this purpose, specifically heavy-duty, insulated food-grade containers that are designed to maintain internal temperatures effectively for extended periods. These containers should be cleaned and sanitized according to the same standards as your kitchen equipment, as they serve as an extension of your primary food storage infrastructure. Before loading any product, verify that the interior of the transport vehicle is clean, free from chemical contaminants, and devoid of potential pest harborages. Never transport food in vehicles that have recently carried hazardous materials or non-food items that could pose a cross-contamination risk. The mechanical integrity of your transport units is just as vital as the thermal efficiency of the insulated containers holding the food. Logistical planning requires more than just careful packing. It involves creating a detailed time window map for every stage of your delivery process. You must ensure that the total time between departure from your controlled environment and arrival at the venue stays within the bounds of your established food safety protocols. Upon reaching the destination, the first step is always to verify the internal temperature of the food using a calibrated probe thermometer. If temperatures have drifted outside the safe range, you must have a pre-planned corrective action ready, which might necessitate the immediate discarding of the product if safety cannot be guaranteed. Never assume that the food has remained safe simply because it was placed in an insulated container initially. Each transit is a high-stakes event where monitoring must transition from passive observation to active documented verification. Temporary service sites often lack the robust infrastructure found in a permanent commercial kitchen, but they must still comply with fundamental food code requirements. You are responsible for ensuring that the destination facility provides adequate hand washing stations, proper lighting, and reliable access to potable water. Even if you are serving in an open-air tent or a rented banquet hall, the management of cross-contamination vectors remains your full responsibility. Set up separate areas for raw and ready-to-eat foods if preparation is occurring on site, and ensure that all staff members are trained to follow sanitization procedures despite the unconventional surroundings. Managers must oversee the entire flow of service, from the initial loading to the final breakdown, to ensure that no shortcuts are taken in the name of convenience. Consistency in safety procedures is the only buffer against foodborne illness when the kitchen moves out the door. We will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back, and today we are shifting our focus toward the systematic implementation of active managerial control within your food service facility. Active managerial control represents a deliberate strategy to shift your food safety posture from being reactive to proactive. Instead of merely responding to crises as they emerge, you consciously build a framework to anticipate and mitigate foodborne illness risk factors before they cause harm. This requires you to move beyond basic compliance and integrate food safety into the DNA of your operation. When you manage proactively, you stop treating sanitation as a task that happens periodically and start viewing it as a continuous, structured operational habit. This systemic approach is essential because it addresses the human error factor, which is the root cause of many food safety breaches. You are not just overseeing food, you are overseeing a complex set of processes that must remain within safe parameters at all times. By focusing on this implementation, you prepare yourself to lead a team that understands the why behind every safety protocol, not just the how. The foundation of effective management begins with the identification of unique hazards specific to your facility. As no two kitchens are identical, you must analyze your menu, your physical layout, and your workflow to determine where potential failures might occur. Once these risks are identified, you translate that knowledge into clear, actionable standard operating procedures that leave no room for ambiguity. A policy on cooling food, for example, is useless if it is vague. It must specify exactly how, when, and by whom the temperature must be tracked and recorded. These procedures serve as the single source of truth for your staff, ensuring that everyone operates under the same rigorous standard of excellence. Consistency in this area creates a predictable environment where errors are mitigated by design rather than by chance. Training must be treated as a continuous exercise rather than a one-time event that occurs during the initial onboarding of a new staff member. You should view every shift as an opportunity to reinforce, teach, and correct behaviors that deviate from your established protocols. When you monitor critical tasks, you are not acting as a police officer, but rather as an architect who ensures the building remains structurally sound. This requires you to be physically present on the floor, observing workflows, and providing immediate feedback when a gap in safety occurs. If you see a team member rushing a cooling process or failing to verify the temperature of a receiving shipment, you must address the corrective action immediately. Effective management is about closing the loop, confirming that the corrective action taken has actually neutralized the original risk before the product moves to the next stage of service. Ultimately, implementing active managerial control is about documentation and consistent enforcement of your internal standards. You need to create logs or digital systems that prove your procedures are being followed, as these records are the primary evidence of your due diligence. If it is not recorded, you cannot prove that it happened, which leaves you vulnerable during regulatory inspections. You must make it clear to your employees that these monitoring tasks are not optional rituals, but are the most critical part of their roles. By making safety a visible and non-negotiable expectation, you build a culture where everyone feels ownership over the product. This structural rigor minimizes the impact of human error, as your systems act as a safety net that catches issues before they ever manifest as illnesses in your patrons. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this module, where we will examine the systematic process of conducting a hazard analysis to build a robust food safety foundation. You will learn how to evaluate your specific operational menu and flow to pinpoint potential biological, chemical, and physical threats. Conducting a hazard analysis is fundamentally an engineering exercise in risk management, rather than a simple checklist exercise. You must approach your kitchen layout and menu with the same rigor a software architect applies to a distributed system. The process begins by cataloging every food item on your menu and mapping how it moves through your operation, from arrival at the loading dock to service. By doing this, you identify the specific points where a process might fail, leading to contaminated food. A biological hazard might enter during receiving, a chemical hazard could be introduced via improper sanitizer handling, and a physical hazard might originate from poor storage maintenance. Viewing your kitchen as a series of interconnected state machines helps in isolating where these hazards emerge. You are effectively looking for the points of failure in your food's life cycle. To make this analysis manageable, you should group your menu items by their process flows rather than treating every dish as a unique entity. Most kitchens utilize three primary process categories to simplify this work: food prepared for immediate service, food prepared for hot holding, and food that involves complex preparation involving multiple temperature changes. For instance, a salad involves no cooking step, which places the burden of safety entirely on purchasing and handling to prevent contamination. Conversely, a protein that is cooked, cooled, and reheated passes through the temperature danger zone multiple times, significantly increasing your exposure to biological risks. By categorizing your menu, you create clear baseline controls for each group that are easier to monitor and maintain effectively. This modular approach ensures that your preventative controls are focused where the risk is highest. As you build this analysis, you must document the specific hazards at each stage of your operational flow. You are essentially creating a formal record of your kitchen's safety vulnerabilities, which serves as the heart of your hazard analysis critical control point system. It is not enough to simply know a risk exists. You must define the stage where that risk occurs, such as receiving, storage, preparation, or service. For example, if you are conducting an analysis on ground beef, the hazard is likely the survival of pathogens during cooking. If the hazard is physical, such as a metal shaving from a blender, you identify the preparation stage as the origin point. This detailed documentation allows you to move towards setting critical limits later in your management plan. Precise identification is the prerequisite for all subsequent food safety interventions. Once you have identified the hazards, the next step involves evaluating the likelihood of occurrence and the severity of the potential impact on public health. You are essentially performing a risk assessment for every stage identified in your flowchart. If a hazard is clearly preventable through standard operating procedures, such as proper hand washing, it becomes part of your foundational prerequisite programs. If the hazard is such that it requires a specific control point to keep the food safe, you acknowledge that this step is critical to your operation. This disciplined approach means that you are not guessing at which food safety practices matter most. You are aligning your management resources with the data revealed by your analysis of the actual workflow. Building a system like this ensures that your kitchen is not just reactive to health inspectors, but proactive in its daily operations. By standardizing the way food flows through your facility, you significantly reduce the complexity that often leads to human error. When employees understand that a specific dish requires different handling based on its process category, they are better equipped to adhere to safety standards. Every piece of hardware, every storage shelf, and every piece of cooling equipment should be viewed through the lens of this hazard study. This is the strategic layer of food safety management that distinguishes a disorganized environment from one designed for consistent, safe output. You now have the framework to begin determining where your critical control points truly reside. See you in the next lesson. Welcome to this module on determining critical control points, a foundational aspect of your HACCP plan. In this lesson, we will focus on identifying the specific steps in your operation where intervention is essential to ensure food safety. In the hazard analysis and critical control point system, a critical control point, or CCP, is a specific step where control can be applied to prevent, eliminate, or reduce a food safety hazard to an acceptable level. While many steps in a restaurant operation are important for quality or sanitation, a CCP is distinctly different because it is the final line of defense against a hazard that could lead to consumer illness. Think of a control point as any step in the flow of food where issues could arise, such as ordering or storage, while a CCP is a high-stakes bottleneck where the safety of the product is physically determined. For instance, receiving food is a control point where you inspect for quality. But the step where you cook a piece of chicken is a CCP because that temperature application is the only way to destroy surviving pathogens. You must approach this analytical process with precision, as failing to identify these points leaves your operation vulnerable to unmitigated biological or chemical risks. If you cannot identify where these hazards are neutralized, your safety management system remains purely theoretical and unenforceable. When you evaluate your operation, you should utilize a decision tree to determine if a specific step reaches the threshold of a CCP. You must ask yourself whether a control measure exists at this specific step. If the step is specifically designed to eliminate or reduce the hazard to an acceptable level, and most importantly, if a subsequent step in the process will eliminate that hazard later on. If a step is meant to reduce a hazard, such as thoroughly cooking ground beef to an internal temperature of 155 degrees Fahrenheit for 17 seconds, and there is no later step that would catch a failure in that process, you have identified a CCP. However, if you are simply cleaning a surface, that is a prerequisite program or a standard operating procedure, not necessarily a CCP. CCPs are the critical intersections of your workflow, where the physical state of the food is altered to ensure its safety for human consumption. By focusing your limited resources on these specific points, you create a robust system that is both manageable and effective in protecting your customers. Consider the practical application of this logic when evaluating your menu items, particularly those involving raw proteins that require thermal destruction of pathogens. When you grill a steak, the cooking process is a CCP. If you fail to reach the appropriate internal temperature, the pathogen remains viable. And because diners often order steak medium rare, there is no further step to kill those bacteria before consumption. Alternatively, consider a dish like a chilled potato salad. The cooking of the potatoes is a CCP, as is the cooling process. If you fail the cooling stage, perhaps by leaving the potatoes at room temperature for too long, you provide an ideal environment for toxin production. Because no subsequent step in your kitchen will cook out those toxins once they are formed, the cooling stage effectively becomes a CCP that requires strict monitoring and verification. As a manager, your goal is to minimize the number of CCPs to those that are truly vital, as every CCP requires rigorous documentation and corrective action planning. If you identify too many points as critical, your staff will become overwhelmed by the record-keeping burden, which often leads to inaccurate data or complete abandonment of the system. Focus your documentation on the steps that provide the highest return on safety, such as final cooking temperatures, specific cooling rate logs, or checking the concentration of chemical sanitizers. This approach not only keeps your focus on the most dangerous hazards, but also maintains team engagement with the food safety system. By keeping the system efficient and targeted, you foster a culture where staff understands that these specific tasks are non-negotiable for the health of their customers and the longevity of the business. You are essentially shifting the management philosophy from reactive inspection to proactive engineering of your kitchen environment. See you in the next lecture. Hello, and welcome to this session focused on the practical mechanics of maintaining safety within your kitchen. In the framework of a HACCP plan, a critical limit represents the maximum or minimum value to which a physical, biological, or chemical hazard must be controlled at a critical control point to prevent, eliminate, or reduce the hazard to a safe level. These limits are not arbitrary targets. They must be based on scientific data or regulatory standards to ensure they provide a verifiable safety margin. For example, when cooking poultry, the established critical limit is an internal temperature of 165 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 15 seconds. This specific parameter is rooted in the known thermal death point of pathogens such as salmonella, which are common risks in raw poultry. If your process fails to sustain this temperature for the required duration, the critical limit is breached, and the food cannot be considered safe for service. Managers must ensure that these limits are measurable and unambiguous so that any employee can determine, without subjective guesswork, whether the safety criteria have been satisfied. Precision is the primary objective here, as vague standards lead to inconsistent execution and an elevated risk of foodborne illness. Once your critical limits are clearly defined, the next logical step is to implement a robust monitoring program that documents these conditions in real time. Monitoring is not merely an observational act, but a systematic procedure that defines who is responsible for the measurement, the frequency of the check, the equipment used, and the documentation protocol. You must assign specific roles to staff members, ensuring that the person performing the check is properly trained to use calibration-tested tools like metal stem thermometers. The frequency of monitoring is dictated by the nature of the control point. For instance, a continuous monitoring approach is ideal for hot holding units, while periodic checks suffice for other static items. When logging these observations, the record must capture the specific value measured, the date and time of the task, and the initials of the employee who verified the safety status. This documentation becomes your evidence during an inspection, demonstrating that your establishment does not just claim to be safe, but actively validates that safety through disciplined measurement. Without a functional monitoring system, your critical limits exist only in theory, providing no practical protection for your guests or your operations. Effective monitoring relies entirely on the reliability of your measuring equipment and the consistency of the staff assigned to these tasks. You should periodically review your monitoring logs to identify trends or lapses in protocol before they result in a critical failure. If a thermometer is found to be out of calibration, the data collected with that instrument until that point could be considered invalid, necessitating a review of the potentially compromised food. By building a culture where monitoring is seen as a foundational element of daily production, rather than a burdensome administrative chore, you protect the structural integrity of your food safety system. As an experienced manager, you are responsible for overseeing this workflow and ensuring that the human element of your monitoring program remains diligent and accurate. Consistent data collection is the only way to prove that your kitchen is operating within the safety margins required by law and industry standards. See you in the next session. Welcome to the chapter on executing corrective actions, where we focus on the actionable steps a manager must take when a critical limit is breached. In this lesson, we will explore the precise mechanisms behind identifying non-compliance and implementing effective, policy-driven interventions. When we monitor a critical control point and discover that a limit has been exceeded, hesitation is not an option. The immediate objective is to rectify the situation before the food product reaches a state where it poses a significant risk to the consumer. For example, if a thermometer probe indicates that a batch of poultry has not reached its minimum internal cooking temperature within the specified time frame, the manager must immediately intervene. This intervention relies entirely on predetermined protocols established within the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point (HACCP) plan. Relying on intuition is unreliable in such scenarios. You must strictly follow the procedural path laid out for that specific deviation. If the protocol demands that the product be reheated to a specific temperature for a set duration, then that is precisely what must occur. If the protocol dictates that the product has remained in the temperature danger zone for too long to be safely recovered, discard it immediately. Corrective actions extend far beyond the immediate physical management of the food item itself. Every instance of non-compliance serves as a data point indicating a potential systemic failure that requires your expert attention. Once you have managed the product, your next responsibility is to identify the root cause of the deviation. Perhaps the piece of equipment used for holding is malfunctioning, or maybe the staff member misunderstood the temperature logging requirements. By investigating why the breach occurred, you transition from being a reactive participant to a proactive manager. You are not simply fixing a mistake. You are identifying the vulnerability in your process to prevent its recurrence. This is the essence of active managerial control, where documentation becomes your most valuable strategic tool. Recording the deviation, the action taken, and the subsequent resolution creates a trail of evidence that proves your system is functioning, even when errors occur. Documentation must be thorough, objective, and contemporaneous to be of any real value during a regulatory inspection. When you record a corrective action, you should explicitly state the time of the discovery, the specific reading that indicated the breach, the exact steps taken to correct the hazard, and the final state of the food product. This detailed record-keeping is not merely an administrative exercise. It is a critical component of your food safety management system. Should an inspector question why a specific batch of soup was discarded, your log should provide an immediate, coherent justification based on established policy. Furthermore, these records help you track recurring issues, allowing you to identify if a particular piece of equipment or a specific workflow is consistently underperforming. A rigorous approach to documentation ensures that your decision-making process is transparent and defensible, reinforcing the structural integrity of your overall safety program. Ultimately, effective corrective actions are the safety net that protects both your customers and your business reputation from the consequences of foodborne illness. By normalizing the implementation of these steps, you embed a culture of accountability where staff members understand that procedures exist for a purpose. They learn to view a temperature breach not as a cause for panic, but as a known contingency with a predefined resolution. Your leadership in this area validates the rigor of your food safety management system and ensures that adherence to standards is maintained even under pressure. When the unexpected occurs, you rely on the training and the systems you have built, treating each incident as an opportunity to sharpen the operational excellence of your kitchen. Consistency in these high-stakes moments is exactly what distinguishes a competent manager from one who is fully prepared for professional certification. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the final administrative components of the HACCP framework by focusing on system verification and essential record-keeping practices. A robust food safety management system is not a set-it-and-forget-it installation, but rather a living process that requires constant validation to ensure it performs as designed. As a manager, you must move beyond the initial creation of your plan to actively verify that the established critical limits are actually being met on the floor. This involves routine reviews of internal temperature logs to spot trends, such as a refrigerator consistently lingering at the edge of the danger zone, which might indicate a need for maintenance before a total system failure occurs. You should also analyze your corrective action reports regularly, as these documents provide a diagnostic view of where processes break down most frequently during daily operations. If you notice the same station consistently triggering corrective actions, it is a clear signal that the underlying procedure is either inherently flawed or is not being clearly communicated to the kitchen staff. Verification also extends to the physical reliability of your monitoring equipment through scheduled calibration audits. You cannot rely on a thermometer that is off by even a few degrees, as this error compounds across every temperature check performed during a shift. By establishing a formal schedule for verifying the accuracy of all sensing equipment, you create a baseline of trust for all your recorded data. Furthermore, you must move away from your desk and perform direct observations of staff behaviors to see if the written plan matches the reality of the kitchen. A written SOP regarding the proper cooling of stocks is meaningless if the actual practice involves leaving pots out at ambient temperatures for hours. By physically verifying these tasks, you ensure that your safety culture is grounded in consistent, observable actions, rather than just policies on a shelf. Maintaining precise records is the foundational requirement for demonstrating compliance during any regulatory health department inspection. These records must include your original hazard analysis and the finalized written food safety plan, as these demonstrate your proactive commitment to risk mitigation. Beyond the setup documentation, you are legally required to maintain organized archives of your operational logs, ranging from daily temperature checks to receiving and sanitizing logs. These documents are your evidence that the system did not just exist, but was actively managed and adjusted over time. The storage and duration of these logs are dictated by local codes, but maintaining them in a clean, chronological format typically simplifies the inspector's workflow and reflects high managerial standards. Effective record-keeping transforms fragmented data points into a cohesive narrative of safety that protects your establishment during formal audits. When an inspector walks through your facility, they are looking for objective evidence that your control measures are functioning correctly. If you can produce a log showing that a refrigerator temperature shift caused a documented corrective action that returned the unit to a safe range, you have proven that your system works. Without such records, an inspector must assume the failure went unnoticed, which inevitably leads to citations or further scrutiny of your practices. By treating verification as a high-priority daily task rather than an administrative burden, you solidify the effectiveness of your food safety program and protect your operation from avoidable compliance failures. See you in the next lecture. Welcome to this chapter on facility design, where we will examine how the physical structure of your kitchen acts as a primary defense against contamination. We're going to explore the engineering standards necessary to build an environment that is not only compliant with health codes, but inherently safer for food production. When we approach the design and layout of a food service facility, we are essentially building a system where hygiene is baked into the architecture itself. The fundamental rule for any surface in a kitchen is that it must be smooth, durable, and non-absorbent to prevent the soil and moisture accumulation that inevitably leads to bacterial growth. If a surface is porous, such as bare wood or cracked concrete, it becomes an uncontrollable reservoir for pathogens that standard cleaning protocols simply cannot reach. By selecting materials like stainless steel, high-grade ceramic tile, or sealed concrete, we ensure that every surface can be effectively sanitized. This materiality extends to the very junctions between walls and floors, which require specific attention. We utilize coving, which is a curved, sealed edge that replaces hard 90-degree corners, making it impossible for debris to collect in hidden crevices. The goal is to create a seamless landscape where cleaning is not a battle against the geometry of the room. Layout planning is the process of mapping the flow of food to prevent the inevitable risks of cross-contamination. A sound design philosophy dictates that the flow of goods should always move in one direction, from receiving and storage through prep and cooking, and finally to service, without these paths crossing. When your dirty dish return area is positioned too close to the raw food preparation station, You are creating a recipe for disaster by allowing biological hazards to migrate from returned items onto clean serviceware. You must also consider the placement of hand washing sinks, which must be conveniently located and dedicated solely to that purpose to encourage consistent usage. A well-designed kitchen treats workflow as a logical sequence of operations, where each zone is separated to minimize the contact between raw ingredients and finished meals. If you think of this like a software pipeline, you are essentially reducing the noise in your system by ensuring that inputs are clearly separated from outputs until the final delivery phase. The invisible components of your facility are just as critical as the physical ones, particularly regarding your ventilation and lighting systems. A high-performing ventilation system is not merely a comfort feature. It is an essential sanitation tool designed to remove heat, moisture, and grease that would otherwise settle on surfaces and accelerate bacterial proliferation. Grease accumulation on ceilings and walls creates a tacky, organic film that acts as a breeding ground for microorganisms and a severe fire hazard. Similarly, your lighting must be designed with safety and visibility in mind, ensuring that staff can effectively inspect food quality and cleanliness during all phases of operation. All light bulbs in food prep and storage areas should be shatter-resistant or shielded to prevent broken glass from contaminating the food supply in the event of a failure. By investing in these foundational elements, you are reducing the dependency on constant manual intervention to maintain safety standards. You are now equipped with the principles needed to design a facility that works for you rather than against you. I will catch you in the next lesson. Welcome to our session on equipping your kitchen with standards that ensure safety and regulatory compliance. We are going to explore how proper hardware selection and installation serve as the foundation for a sanitary food production environment. When we choose equipment for a commercial kitchen, we are not simply looking for utility or brand reputation, but rather for hardware that meets specific safety standards established by organizations like NSF International and other ANSI-accredited bodies. These standards exist because the physical composition of an appliance determines how easily it can be cleaned and, consequently, how effectively it resists the buildup of pathogens. You must prioritize equipment labeled as food grade, which implies the materials are non-absorbent, non-toxic, and resistant to corrosion even when exposed to typical kitchen chemicals and high heat. If a piece of equipment has crevices, deep pits, or surfaces that absorb moisture, it becomes a sanctuary for microorganisms that will inevitably lead to cross-contamination. Selecting inferior equipment is essentially building technical debt into your operation, as you will spend significantly more time and labor attempting to sanitize surfaces that were not designed for the rigors of food production. Always verify that stickers or identifiers from reputable testing organizations are present, as these symbols assure you that the product has undergone rigorous testing for structural integrity and sanitation. Beyond the materials themselves, the design of the equipment must facilitate total access for maintenance and deep cleaning. This means that if a machine has a complex internal geometry, it must be easily dismantled without requiring a toolbox or significant downtime. Smooth finishes are non-negotiable because they prevent food particles from becoming trapped in microscopic indentations. Think of these material requirements as a form of interface design. The interface between the food and the machine must be as clean as the air it occupies. Any degradation in the surface, such as rust or peeling coatings, acts as a failure point where biofilms can form, escaping the reach of your standard cleaning protocols. By mandating that all equipment is built to these strict physical requirements, we ensure that the kitchen is a system where the hardware actively supports your hygiene goals rather than sabotaging them. Installation is the second component of these standards, and it is governed by the need to maintain an environment where pests cannot hide and sanitation is possible. For heavy equipment that sits directly on the floor, you cannot simply place it and call it a day, as gaps under the unit will inevitably collect food debris and liquid, becoming a petri dish for unwanted organisms. If the equipment is heavy and stationary, it must be sealed to the floor using a high-quality, food-safe sealant, or it must be mounted on legs high enough to provide clearance. The industry standard is to provide at least 6 inches of space beneath floor-mounted equipment to allow your staff to sweep, mop, and sanitize the floor area without any obstruction. If you cannot clean under it, you cannot guarantee the safety of the ground upon which your staff stands and transports ingredients. Countertop equipment requires a similar approach, though the scale changes slightly to match the physical properties of the units. For equipment that rests on tables or counters, you must provide at least 4 inches of clearance, which allows for proper airflow and effective cleaning of the surface beneath the unit. This standard prevents the buildup of grease and food residue that common kitchen tools cannot reach, which are classic nesting grounds for pests like cockroaches and rodents. When a health inspector enters your facility, they are not just looking at the temperature logs. They are physically looking under and around your machinery to see if you have accounted for these installation mandates. If you have neglected to provide these clearances, or if your sealant has cracked and become a trap for debris, you have a critical failure in your facility maintenance. Adhering to these height and ceiling requirements is an active control measure that minimizes the risk of physical and biological contamination in your workspace. Consistent application of these rules creates a predictable environment across all your stations. Whether you are installing a new commercial reach-in refrigerator or a series of stainless steel prep tables, the logic remains the same. You are designing a system that resists failure by making the right action, cleaning the floor or wiping down a surface, the path of least resistance. When equipment is elevated or properly sealed, the sanitation task becomes a routine interaction rather than an invasive, labor-intensive project. Investing in compliant, high-quality equipment saves on maintenance costs over time because it resists the environmental stressors of heat, moisture, and chemical exposure that destroy lower-grade alternatives. Take the time to audit your current kitchen layout against these height and surface standards to identify any legacy equipment that might be introducing unnecessary risk into your daily operations. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we explore the essential technical distinction between cleaning a surface and sanitizing it to ensure operational safety. When we approach the maintenance of a professional kitchen, we often conflate cleaning with sanitizing. Yet these are two distinct chemical and physical processes. Cleaning is the foundational act of removing food, soil, grease, or other visible debris from a surface, usually achieved through the application of soap or detergent combined with friction. If a surface is not first cleaned of this organic matter, the subsequent sanitizing step will fail because the soil acts as a barrier, preventing the sanitizer from ever reaching the pathogens it is meant to neutralize. Sanitizing, by contrast, is the process of reducing the number of pathogens on a clean surface to safe levels, typically achieved through either high-temperature thermal application or chemical agents. Understanding this workflow is a prerequisite for any food safety manager, as you cannot sanitize a dirty surface, and you cannot assume a clean surface is safe for food production. We treat these as sequential, non-negotiable steps in every sanitation standard operating procedure because ignoring one renders the other ineffective. The effectiveness of chemical sanitizers is governed by a set of rigid variables that require constant monitoring to ensure compliance and safety. Chief among these is the concentration of the chemical solution, which we measure in parts per million, or ppm, using specialized test kits designed for specific sanitizer types. If the concentration is too low, the solution fails to kill the microorganisms effectively. If it is too high, it becomes toxic to patrons and often leaves behind a harmful residue. Water temperature also plays a critical role, as most chemical sanitizers are formulated to function optimally within specific thermal ranges, usually aligned with room temperature conditions. Beyond concentration and temperature, the hardness of the water supply and its pH level significantly impact how well the sanitizer solution maintains its efficacy over time. A failure in any one of these variables can lead to the inactivation of the chemical agent, leaving your food contact surfaces vulnerable to contamination despite your best efforts to maintain a sanitizing regimen. In the professional environment, we primarily deploy 3 types of chemical sanitizers, each with their own unique operational requirements. Chlorine-based sanitizers are perhaps the most common, valued for their quick action against a wide variety of microorganisms, though they are highly sensitive to soil levels and pH changes. Iodine solutions are another alternative, working effectively at lower concentrations and proving themselves less susceptible to the organic load than chlorine, though they can sometimes stain certain surfaces. Quaternary ammonium compounds, colloquially known as quats, offer a different set of advantages, as they remain stable over a wider range of temperatures and pH levels while leaving behind a lingering, effective disinfectant film on surfaces. Regardless of the chemical chosen, you must adhere to the required contact time. which is the duration the surface must stay wet with the solution to achieve the desired pathogen reduction. Rushing the process by wiping away the sanitizer prematurely is a common error that voids the entire benefit of the sanitizing sequence. While chemicals are standard for most surface applications, thermal sanitizing represents a potent alternative, most commonly seen in high-temperature dishwashing machines. This method relies on the physics of heat transfer to denature the proteins of microorganisms, effectively destroying them without the risk of chemical residue. To be considered an effective thermal sanitizing process, the water temperature must reach at least 171 degrees Fahrenheit, and the item must be submerged or subjected to this heat for a sufficient duration. This approach is highly effective in large-scale operations and reduces the complexity of managing chemical inventory, provided the equipment is maintained to consistently deliver the required heat. Integrating these variables, concentration, temperature, contact time, and water quality, into your daily routine forms the core of an effective sanitation standard operating procedure. Mastery of these metrics ensures that your facility consistently meets the rigorous safety requirements demanded by modern health regulations. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will focus on the technical requirements for operating and maintaining mechanical warewashing systems to ensure consistent sanitization. Commercial mechanical warewashing systems are the backbone of a sanitary kitchen, but they only function correctly when specific operational parameters are met. A manager must understand that these machines operate under two distinct sanitization methods, each with strictly mandated temperature requirements. High-temperature machines rely on heat to destroy pathogens, necessitating that the final sanitizing rinse reaches a temperature of at least 180 degrees Fahrenheit. If you are using a stationary single-temperature rack machine, this requirement is slightly lower at 165 degrees Fahrenheit. Conversely, chemical sanitizing machines operate at lower water temperatures and depend on a specific concentration of chemical sanitizer to achieve the same result. You must frequently check that these chemical levels are within the manufacturer's specified range, as insufficient concentration renders the entire cycle ineffective. Because these machines are mechanical, they are prone to subtle failures that can compromise food safety if left unchecked. Continuous monitoring is not merely a task, but a mandatory aspect of your managerial control system. You should regularly observe the machine's built-in pressure gauges to ensure that water pressure remains within the levels recommended by the manufacturer. If the pressure is too low, the water will not properly reach all surfaces of the items, leading to poor cleaning results and potential survival of microorganisms. To verify that high-temperature machines are actually reaching the required heat levels during the cycle, you must use irreversible heat indicators or heat-sensitive tapes. These tools provide a permanent record that the critical limit was met, which is invaluable during an audit or a self-inspection. Furthermore, you must never overload the racks, as crowding items prevents water from circulating freely and shadows the surfaces that need sanitation. Overloading is a common operational error that leads to rewashing and unnecessary resource consumption. Maintenance is as critical as operation, and your role includes overseeing daily upkeep that preserves the machine's integrity. The internal spray arms are particularly susceptible to clogs from food debris, limescale, and mineral buildup, which obstruct nozzles and impede water flow. These arms must be inspected and cleaned daily to ensure the mechanical action of the machine remains consistent. If you observe any irregularities in the wash cycle, such as an incomplete rinse or a malfunctioning drain, you must halt operations until a correction is implemented. In instances where the mechanical dishwasher is unavailable, you are responsible for managing the manual three-compartment sink operations. This manual process requires a strict sequence of washing in detergent, rinsing in clean water, and sanitizing in either a hot water or chemical solution. Maintaining the high standard of your warewashing procedures is one of the most effective ways to prevent the spread of biological contaminants throughout your facility. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today we examine the structure of an integrated pest management system, commonly known as IPM, which is a systematic approach to preventing pest infestations in a professional kitchen. An effective integrated pest management system is built upon three foundational pillars that work in concert to eliminate the threat of pests from your facility. The primary objective is to deny access, which requires a rigorous examination of the physical structure of your building to identify potential entry points for rodents and insects. You must inspect all exterior walls, foundations, and floors for cracks, crevices, or gaps that could serve as portals for pests. Installing air curtains at delivery doors and ensuring that window screens are in good repair provides a mechanical barrier against flying insects when doors must remain open. Sealing gaps around utility pipes and service conduits with concrete or heavy-duty wire mesh effectively mitigates access routes that are often overlooked during routine maintenance inspections. By hardening the perimeter of your facility, you drastically reduce the pressure on downstream interventions. Once you've secured the perimeter, your second focus involves denying food, water, and shelter, which effectively starves out any intruders that might have bypassed your structural defenses. Pests only thrive in environments where they can access consistent nutrient sources and harborages, so your sanitation program must be absolute. All trash must be stored in pest-proof containers with tight-fitting lids, and dumpsters should be positioned on a concrete slab away from the building's main entrance. In the kitchen, organic debris and moisture accumulation are the primary drivers of insect populations. Therefore, floors must be kept dry and free of food scraps at all times. Storage areas should be organized to keep supplies at least 6 inches off the floor and away from walls to allow for routine inspections and to eliminate undisturbed nesting sites. By removing the factors that encourage biological life, you change the environment from a habitat into a hostile zone for pests. The third and final pillar of a robust IPM program is the formal partnership with a licensed pest control operator, or PCO. While a manager can effectively maintain physical barriers and sanitation, the specialized application of chemical pesticides requires expertise and legal compliance that falls outside the scope of daily food service operations. A PCO is trained to identify the specific life cycles of local pests and can apply restricted-use chemicals in a manner that protects food safety while effectively managing infestation vectors. You must never attempt to apply pesticide sprays or powders within a kitchen yourself, as this creates a significant risk of chemical contamination of food contact surfaces. Instead, facilitate the PCO's work by providing access to your facility and maintaining a detailed log of all services performed, including the dates and specific locations where treatments occurred. This record serves as vital documentation during health inspections to prove your facility is being professionally managed. When chemical treatments are necessary, they must be stored and labeled with the same level of scrutiny as your food inventory. If an emergency requires you to store a restricted pesticide on site, it must be kept in its original container, clearly labeled with the manufacturer's instructions, and stored in a locked cabinet specifically designated for hazardous materials. Always consult the Safety Data Sheet, or SDS, for any chemical brought into the facility to understand the correct disposal methods and emergency response protocols. Staff members should be trained to recognize the signs of infestation, such as droppings, chewed ingredients, or unusual odors, and the reporting process must be clearly defined. Integrating these three pillars, denial of entry, denial of environment, and professional cooperation, creates a sustainable safety culture that protects the physical integrity of your establishment and the health of your customers. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this chapter, we will master the professional protocols required for navigating health inspections and managing critical facility emergencies. When an environmental health officer arrives at your facility, your primary objective is to maintain a professional, cooperative posture throughout the interaction. You should immediately ask for official identification and ensure the inspector has cleared your facility's security protocols before allowing them access to prep and storage areas. Rather than viewing the inspection as an adversarial event, treat it as a collaborative consultation where you accompany the inspector during the entire walkthrough. By staying present, you can ask clarifying questions, document any noted deficiencies in real time, and ensure you fully understand the nature of any cited violations. Being proactive and transparent demonstrates your commitment to food safety and often helps clarify minor misunderstandings before they are formally recorded. If an inspector identifies a violation, resist the urge to argue defensively. Instead, focus on objective assessment and confirm the regulatory reference for the observation. This collaborative approach creates a professional dialogue that is invaluable when you later need to discuss corrective actions or mitigation strategies with your team. By maintaining a calm, orderly demeanor, You signal to your staff that health standards are a core element of your organizational culture, rather than a bureaucratic hurdle. Once a health inspection is concluded, you must shift your focus toward developing a rapid and effective corrective action plan for each observation. You should evaluate each deficiency based on its risk to public health, prioritizing critical violations, such as improper holding temperatures or cross-contamination risks, over structural or cosmetic issues. Establish a timeline for these corrections that is reasonable yet demonstrates a sense of urgency, and clearly communicate the necessary changes to your staff as soon as the inspector leaves. Documenting your corrective actions is just as important as performing them, as these records serve as evidence of your compliance and diligence for future internal or regulatory reviews. If you disagree with an inspector's interpretation of the food code, approach the resolution through the appropriate administrative channels rather than confronting the officer on the floor. Most local regulatory agencies provide specific appeal processes or opportunities for informal conferences where you can present supporting documentation or evidence. Maintaining a clean, well-recorded history of your inspections and responses builds a reputation of reliability and compliance for your establishment in the eyes of local health authorities. Beyond routine inspections, you must also be prepared to manage sudden, imminent health hazards that could necessitate the temporary closure of your facility. Situations such as a significant sewage backup, an extended power outage that compromises your cold-holding equipment, or a total loss of potable water supply are considered absolute threats to public health. Under such conditions, the legal requirement is generally to cease operations immediately, as the risk of foodborne illness becomes unacceptably high. When an emergency strikes, your priority is to safeguard the public by preventing the service of potentially compromised food items. You should have a pre-developed emergency response plan that includes clear communication chains for your staff, your supply chain partners, and local health authorities. Assessing damage often requires technical support, and you should ensure that all structural repairs are verified as compliant with local building and health codes before you attempt to reopen. Resuming operations too quickly without addressing the underlying safety failure can lead to severe legal and financial repercussions, including the permanent loss of your operating permit. A principled manager treats these moments not merely as a hurdle to overcome, but as a critical duty to protect the health of every customer who walks through the door. See you in the next lesson. Welcome to the final stage of your preparation, where we will synthesize everything you have learned to ensure you are ready for the certification exam. In this session, we will consolidate our knowledge of core safety competencies and navigate the administrative requirements for your official registration. To approach the exam successfully, you must view the 8 pillars of food safety not as isolated facts, but as an interconnected ecosystem of risk management. We have walked through the biological, chemical, and physical hazards, understanding that pathogens utilize the fat-tom environmental factors to proliferate. You should maintain a mental map of the big 6 pathogens and the specific symptoms that mandate immediate exclusion from work. Remember that your primary role is to intercept these hazards using the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point, or HACCP methodology. By identifying critical control points and establishing strictly monitored limits, you transition from reactive labor to proactive managerial control. Ensure that you can articulate the reasoning behind corrective actions, as the exam often presents scenarios that test your ability to fix a deviation before it compromises public health. When reviewing the flow of food, focus your attention on the precise thresholds that define safe operation. We have established that receiving temperatures, storage hierarchy, and the specifics of date marking are not merely guidelines, but mandatory safety boundaries that prevent the growth of listeria and other contaminants. As you audit your internal readiness, keep the distinction between cleaning, which removes visible soil, and sanitizing, which reduces pathogens to safe levels, at the forefront of your thinking. Rehearse the minimum internal temperatures for various proteins, recalling that poultry must reach 165 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 seconds. Similarly, maintain a clear understanding of the 2-stage cooling process and the importance of using calibrated thermometers to verify these critical limits. If you can justify your operational decisions based on these concrete regulatory metrics, you will find the exam questions much more accessible. Administrative readiness is just as critical as technical knowledge when it comes to securing your credential. Once you feel confident in your mastery of the material, proceed to the National Restaurant Association website to finalize your exam registration. You will need to select between an in-person, proctored environment or a remote proctored session, each of which has specific hardware and software requirements you must verify beforehand. If you are taking the exam at a test center, ensure you have a valid photo identification and your confirmation ticket ready. For those using the remote option, perform a system check well in advance to ensure your webcam, microphone, and internet connection meet the examination software standards. Treat this documentation process with the same level of care you provide to temperature logging in your kitchen, as errors here can delay your certification. Before you sit for the exam, conduct a final validation check of your study consistency. Review the personal hygiene framework once more, ensuring you can identify which habits contribute to cross-contamination, such as improper glove use or failure to handle wounds according to the code. Consider the logistical aspects of facility management, including the integrated pest management program and the necessity of keeping current verification records available for inspectors. You have accumulated a substantial amount of information, and the key to success now is synthesis. Stop looking at the curriculum as a list of independent topics and start seeing it as a singular, robust safety system. If you have followed the guidance on active managerial control, you already possess the judgment necessary to navigate the complexities asked of a certified manager. Trust the framework of the food safety system we have discussed, apply it consistently to the scenarios on your screen, and you will secure your certification. I will see you on the other side of your exam success.